Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. It was just another night like any other. I had just finished my homework, the house was quiet, and my parents were off running errands. I decided to spend the evening in my room, watching videos on my laptop and scrolling through social media. I wasn't tired, but I did want some background noise. So, I pulled up a few random ghost story videos to keep me entertained while I scrolled through my feed. I didn't believe in ghosts or paranormal stuff, at least not the way some people did. I thought it was all just stories, crazy videos, people trying to get attention, or maybe just things people couldn't explain. So, I wasn't scared. It wasn't until I saw the video titled Paranormal Activity Caught on Camera that everything changed. The thumbnail showed a blurry figure standing in a dark hallway, but I thought nothing of it. I clicked on it. The video started like any other ghost story, shaky footage of an old house. The camera was obviously handheld, and the person filming was walking slowly, as if they were sneaking around. It was dark, and the person filming would occasionally pause to point the camera at doors, windows, and shadows. Then, in the middle of the video, the camera caught something. A shadow, creeping just out of view, moving faster than it should have been. The person filming jumped, dropped the camera, and the video cut off. My heart raced for a second. Was that real? I quickly brushed off the thought. Ghosts weren't real. It was just another well-made video meant to get people like me to watch and get scared. But then, the weirdest thing happened. As I scrolled to the next video, my laptop screen flickered. I wasn't sure if it was just a glitch or if it was something with my Wi-Fi, but the flicker happened again. The screen went black for a second and then came back on, showing a strange, grainy image. I froze. The picture on my screen wasn't from the video I had just watched. It was a picture of a hallway. I knew that hallway. It was my own. It took a moment for me to realize what was happening. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled to make sense of it. The grainy picture zoomed in on a corner of the hallway. My hallway. The one just outside my room. And standing there, barely visible, was a shadow. It looked like someone was standing there, staring at the camera. I quickly closed the laptop and rushed out of my room, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I checked the hallway. Empty. I breathed a sigh of relief. My mind was playing tricks on me. It was probably just a glitch in my laptop, right? But when I went back into my room, I saw something on my desk that made my blood run cold. It was my camera, the one I used for school projects and sometimes to record random stuff. I hadn't touched it all day. I didn't even remember putting it on my desk, but there it was, facing toward the hallway. I stared at it, a sinking feeling growing in my stomach. I hadn't used that camera in weeks. I always kept it in a drawer. I picked it up and checked the memory card. It was full. I clicked through the files, and as I did, my hands started to shake. There were a few videos. Nothing unusual, just some footage from my projects. But then, near the end of the list, I found a file that stood out, untitled. My pulse quickened as I opened it. The video started playing. It was dark, and the camera was shaking slightly. It looked like it was being held by someone walking through a hallway. I didn't have to look hard to know where it was. That was my hallway. The camera moved toward the stairs, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall, dark, and not quite human, stood at the end of the hallway. It was hard to make out, but the longer I looked, the more details I could make out. It had no face, just a void. The figure didn't move, it just stood there. And then, suddenly, it turned its head towards the camera. I gasped and backed away from my desk, dropping the camera on the floor. The screen flickered and went black. What was that? How had my camera caught that? I looked at the video again, and the figure was still there, standing still, staring into the lens. It didn't move. Then, as I was about to turn off the camera, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a whisper. My heart thumped in my chest. I wasn't sure if it was the video or if it was coming from somewhere else, but I could hear it clearly. I'm here. I slammed the laptop shut, my breath ragged. I stood frozen in place for what felt like forever, not sure what to do. There was no way this was real. My brain tried to convince me it was all just a trick of the light, a glitch, something explainable. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. I picked up the camera again, this time more carefully. I tried to shut it off, but the screen stayed on, flickering between static and the hallway footage. My hands trembled as I turned it off manually. I don't know what happened that night. I didn't sleep a wink. I kept hearing things, whispers, creaks, footsteps in the hall. Every time I checked, the hallway was empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. The next morning, I took the camera and the laptop to my parents. They didn't believe me at first. They laughed it off and assumed I was just imagining things. But when I showed them the footage, they went quiet. My dad checked the camera and said it seemed like there was nothing unusual on it. No strange recordings, nothing out of the ordinary. But I knew what I had seen. That night, I set up the camera again, just to see if I could catch something else. It felt stupid, but I couldn't help myself. As I turned off the lights and sat on my bed, I heard a loud bang from the hallway. My heart stopped. I grabbed the camera, my hands trembling, and rushed into the hallway. The camera was still recording, but when I played the footage back the next day, all it showed was the empty hallway. No shadows, no figures, just darkness. I tried to forget about it. I really did. I stopped using the camera, turned off my laptop, and pretended nothing had happened. But I couldn't. Every time I passed that hallway, I felt like something was there, watching me. And sometimes, when I lie in bed at night, I hear that whisper again. I'm here. I can't escape it. I can't explain it. All I know is that I'm not alone. Not in my room. Not in my house. I've always been the type of person who enjoys a good scare, especially when it comes to paranormal activity. But after what happened to me last summer, I can't even look at ghost videos or haunted house stories without my heart racing and my hands shaking. I learned the hard way that sometimes there's truth behind those chilling stories. It all started when my cousin Emma invited me to spend the weekend at her new house. She had just moved into a small, old home in a quiet neighborhood, and she was excited to show it off. She told me it had a lot of character, and it was much cheaper than anything else they'd looked at. I remember thinking it was strange that she said character in such a peculiar way, but I brushed it off as just her excitement. The first night I was there, we stayed up late watching movies and chatting. I knew Emma's house was old, but there was something about it that felt off. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the walls seemed to whisper in the silence of the night. It wasn't enough to make me feel uneasy, but it was definitely something I noticed. Around midnight, we decided to play a game. Emma had one of those old-school board games with a creepy theme, something about haunted mansions and cursed objects. We pulled it out, and as we started setting it up, Emma mentioned that the house had a reputation for being active in the paranormal sense. I chuckled, trying to sound brave. Yeah, sure. The house is old. Old houses always have weird noises. But Emma was serious. She told me she'd heard strange things since moving in. Footsteps when no one was walking, doors that would open and close by themselves, and the sound of whispers coming from the attic late at night. I thought she was joking, but the way she spoke made me wonder if she really believed it. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination, but I couldn't help but feel like someone, or something, was watching me. The air was thick and heavy, and the creaking sounds in the house seemed louder than usual. I tried to ignore it and drift off to sleep, but I couldn't. The next morning, Emma was acting a little strange. She was jumpy, constantly looking over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to be standing behind her. I asked her if she was okay, and she hesitated before answering. "There's something in this house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what it is, but I feel like it's always here." At that point, I didn't know what to say. I wanted to brush it off as just nerves, but the more she talked, the more I started to wonder if there was something to her story. That afternoon, we decided to go through the house and explore. Emma showed me the attic, which was filled with old furniture, boxes, and things that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later that night, something strange happened. We were sitting in the living room, talking about random things, when the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. It was late, and everyone else in the house was asleep. Emma's eyes widened, and I saw her face drain of color. I froze, listening to the soft, deliberate steps moving across the floor. They weren't like the creaks of an old house. They were too rhythmic, too purposeful. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered. I nodded, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We both stood up and crept toward the hallway, but when we got there was nothing. The hallway was completely empty. No one was awake. No one had moved. I didn't want to say it out loud, but we both knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, a thick tension that seemed to hang over everything. But we didn't speak about it. We tried to brush it off, and we decided to get some sleep, hoping the sounds would stop. That night, I had the strangest dream. I was in the attic, walking through the dusty, dimly lit space. The air was cold, and there was something in the corner, just out of sight. Every time I tried to get closer, the shadows shifted, moving away from me as if they were alive. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. It took me a moment to realize that I wasn't in the attic. I was in Emma's guest room, but the feeling of dread still lingered. The next day, Emma and I were sitting on the couch when she mentioned something that sent chills down my spine. "I'm thinking about setting up cameras around the house," she said, staring at her phone screen. "I want to see if I can catch something on film." I wasn't sure what she meant by catch something, but I didn't ask. I just agreed, and that night, Emma set up cameras in the hallway, the living room, and even one pointing toward the attic door. We figured it would be a fun way to prove the noises weren't real, just the house settling or the wind. As we sat in the living room, watching the footage on Emma's laptop, everything seemed normal at first. The hallway camera showed nothing but shadows, the living room was empty, and the attic looked unchanged. But then we reached the last camera, the one facing the attic door. The footage was grainy at first, just like the other videos, but as we watched, something moved. A figure, tall and thin, emerged from the attic, stepping into the frame. It was too blurry to make out, but it was definitely there. The figure moved quickly across the hallway, and the door to the attic creaked open on its own. Emma and I both gasped. The camera footage showed the door slowly opening by itself, but there was no wind. No one was awake. I grabbed the laptop, rewinding the video to watch it again. This time, I saw it clearer. The figure was definitely human, but its movements were unnatural, too smooth, like it was floating. And as it passed in front of the camera, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure didn't have a face. I couldn't breathe. I felt trapped, like I was suffocating in the air around me. Emma stared at the screen, her face pale. "I told you," she whispered. "I told you there was something here." We watched the footage for what felt like hours, but the figure never appeared again. The rest of the video was normal, just empty hallways and quiet rooms. I couldn't shake the image of that faceless figure. It felt like it was following me, like it had somehow crawled out of the screen and into the room with us. That night, we didn't sleep much. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind, made us jump. But as the night wore on, the house seemed to settle back into an eerie calm. It wasn't until the morning that I realized what had happened. We were cleaning up the living room when I noticed something strange. There, on the floor next to the door, was a small object. It was a little silver key, with no markings or labels. I didn't recognize it, and Emma said she didn't either. "Where did that come from?" I asked, picking it up. Emma looked nervous. "I don't know. It wasn't there last night." I couldn't explain it. The key didn't belong to anything in the house. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. And when I looked at it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for something I wasn't supposed to find. I left the house the next day, not wanting to stay any longer. But Emma still lives there, and every time I think about what happened, I wonder what the key was for. I wonder if there's something still waiting for her in that house, something that wasn't ready to leave. The cameras were put away after that. Emma never brought them out again, and I haven't been back to visit her since that weekend. Every time I think of her house, I feel that same cold dread creeping up my spine. Maybe some things are better left unexplored. Maybe there's a reason some doors are left unopened. And maybe, just maybe, we should have left that key alone. I used to be the type of person who enjoyed the thrill of watching ghost videos or reading paranormal stories before bed. The idea of haunted places and spooky happenings intrigued me, but I always thought they were just stories, until one night when something happened that turned my world upside down. It all started when I moved into a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. I had just started college, and I was excited to have a space of my own. The apartment was cozy, just a small one-bedroom unit, with a little kitchen and a living room with large windows that faced the street. The building itself was old, probably from the 1950s, but it had a certain charm to it. There was something comforting about the creaking floorboards and the faint smell of old wood. I remember the first few nights I spent there. Everything felt perfectly normal, no strange noises, no weird occurrences. It was just a regular apartment, and I was happy to have a peaceful place to unwind after long days at school. I even set up a camera in the living room one night to record a few videos of my own. Just for fun, nothing too serious. I had always wanted to try making a YouTube channel, and I figured it would be a good start. The first few recordings were nothing special, just random clips of me chatting to the camera. But then, on the fourth night, something strange happened. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone and watching TV. It was late, around midnight, and I had the living room light on. My camera was on a tripod in the corner, pointed toward the window. I had planned on recording a video the next day, but I left the camera running as background noise. I was tired but didn't want to go to sleep just yet, so I stayed up, scrolling through my social media feed. The room was quiet, and the only sounds were from the TV and the occasional cars passing by outside. I didn't think anything of it when I noticed the reflection in the window next to me. It was a faint image, just the reflection of the room and the couch. But something in the reflection caught my eye. In the corner of the window, just at the edge of the reflection, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just my own reflection, but I quickly realized something was wrong. The figure was taller than me, and its outline looked faint, almost transparent. It was standing still, just outside the window, watching me. I froze, my phone slipping from my hand and hitting the couch. I stared at the window, but there was nothing there when I looked directly outside. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run through my body. I slowly turned back to the camera and rewound the footage to the part where I had noticed the figure. I gasped when I saw it again. The figure was still there, standing in the reflection, just beyond the window pane. It was hard to make out its features, but it seemed to be watching me with a strange intensity. I couldn't see its face clearly, but the way it stood, motionless, eerily still, was unsettling. I didn't know what to think. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow from the tree outside or something from the streetlights. But as I continued watching the footage, I saw something even more disturbing. The figure began to move. It wasn't just a subtle shift or a passing shadow. It took slow, deliberate steps, its shape growing clearer and clearer in the reflection. And then, in the most chilling moment of all, the figure turned its head toward me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I watched it. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was like a person, or something pretending to be one, standing in the reflection, staring at me through the glass. I had to stop the video. I couldn't keep watching. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was starting to feel dizzy. I quickly grabbed my phone, thinking maybe I was just imagining things. I opened the camera app and checked the real-time footage of the room. Everything looked normal. There was no one outside the window. But when I glanced back at the video from the camera on the tripod, the figure was still there. I couldn't stop shaking. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I had to get out of there. I turned off the camera and checked the apartment, making sure every door and window was locked. I even went outside and looked around the building, just to reassure myself that there was nothing out of the ordinary. But nothing. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to watch the footage again. I was terrified, but I also needed answers. I had no idea what I had seen the night before, and the thought of a ghost or something paranormal haunting my apartment made my skin crawl. I tried to tell myself it was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. That night, I decided to set up the camera again. I didn't want to, but I had to know if what I saw the previous night was real. This time, I positioned the camera closer to the window and made sure the light was on in the living room, so the reflection would be clearer. I didn't expect anything to happen. I thought I had just imagined the figure before. Maybe it was just some strange optical illusion. But when I reviewed the footage later, my heart nearly stopped. The figure was there again. It wasn't just a shadow or a faint reflection this time. It was clearer, more defined. The figure stood motionless outside the window, watching me from the reflection. It was tall, wearing a long, dark coat, but I couldn't make out its face. It was as if the reflection was trying to show me something that wasn't there, or something that shouldn't be there. I watched in horror as the figure took a slow step forward, and the camera captured every movement. The figure's presence felt overwhelming, as though it was reaching out toward me through the glass. I could feel the coldness of the air as I watched it move, and a sense of dread washed over me. Then, something even stranger happened. The figure in the reflection suddenly disappeared, vanishing from the window entirely. I thought maybe it had moved out of frame, but when I checked the footage, the figure was gone. There was nothing outside the window anymore. But as I watched the footage a few more times, I noticed something else. At the very moment the figure disappeared from the window, I could hear a faint sound, almost like a whisper. It was too quiet to make out the words, but it sounded like it was coming from the other side of the window, just out of reach. I couldn't explain it. It felt like the figure had been watching me, and then it was gone, leaving behind nothing but that eerie whisper. I was no longer sure if it had been a figment of my imagination, but I didn't want to find out. I never used the camera again. I couldn't bring myself to. The idea of that figure lurking just outside my window, watching me, haunted me for days. The feeling of being watched was constant, and even though the apartment seemed quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I moved out of that apartment a few weeks later, not because of the ghostly figure, but because I simply couldn't stand the constant feeling of unease. I didn't tell anyone about the footage, but I still have the video on my old laptop. I don't know why I keep it, but every time I open it, I feel that same chill run through me. To this day, I have no explanation for what I saw in that reflection. Was it a ghost? A figment of my imagination? Or something else entirely? All I know is that I'll never forget that night, and the reflection that seemed to be watching me from just outside the window. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I'll catch myself glancing at windows, half expecting to see a dark figure staring back at me from the other side. And no matter how much time passes, I still feel that cold, unsettling presence, waiting, watching. I'll never forget the day I moved into my new house. It was an old property, one of those homes that seemed too big for the people who lived in it. The kind with a long driveway, large wooden doors, and rooms that echoed when you walked through them. I had always dreamed of owning a place like this, and when I found this one, it felt like a perfect fit. It wasn't exactly perfect. There were creaky floors, some cracked windows, and an odd smell in certain rooms, but it was charming in its own way. The neighbors told me the house had been sitting empty for years, but I never gave that too much thought. What could go wrong with an old house? It wasn't long before I realized something wasn't quite right. It started with the little things. Lights flickering when no one was near the switches, the sound of footsteps when I was alone, and doors that seemed to open by themselves. At first, I assumed it was just the house settling. After all, it was old, and houses like this had a way of making strange noises. But then, things began to escalate. One night, after I had been living there for about a month, I decided to get my camera out. I had been hearing strange sounds coming from the hallway late at night, and the old part of me, the one that loved watching ghost videos and paranormal documentaries, convinced me that maybe I could capture something on tape. I figured I could debunk the noises once and for all. Either they were just the house settling, or there was something else going on. I set up my camera in the hallway, aiming it at the door that led to a small room at the end of the hall. This room had always given me a strange feeling. The door was always locked, and I had no key. I had asked the previous owners about it when I first moved in, but they told me they hadn't used that room in years and had no idea what was inside. It was an odd thing to be locked, especially since the rest of the house was so spacious and seemingly abandoned. That night, I set the camera up, turned on the night vision, and went to bed. I left the sound on, hoping to catch any strange noises. I fell asleep quickly, my mind at ease with the belief that I was just being paranoid. The house wasn't haunted. People just like to tell spooky stories, right? The next morning, I checked the footage. At first, everything seemed normal. The hallway was empty, quiet. The door to the small room was still shut, as it had been when I'd gone to bed. But then something caught my eye. The video showed a small, faint light flickering at the edge of the door, like a candle being blown out and relit again. It was subtle at first, but the longer I watched, the clearer it became. The door slowly creaked open. I froze. The door had been locked. I had checked it before going to sleep, and I was certain it hadn't been opened. But there it was, moving inch by inch, as though someone, or something, was pushing it open from the inside. I watched in disbelief as the door continued to open. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. It was happening in real time, but I couldn't hear any sound. No creak of the door, no footsteps, just the door opening by itself. And then, as the door creaked wide open, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It wasn't fully visible. The camera was still in night vision mode, which distorted the details. But there was enough. The figure appeared to be tall, draped in what looked like tattered clothing. Its face was hidden, almost like it was wrapped in a veil of shadow. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the dim light in the room. I jumped up from my seat, heart racing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, but as I looked at the footage again, the figure had disappeared. The door was now wide open, but there was no sign of anyone or anything inside the room. I had to go check it out. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if I had just witnessed something truly terrifying, but I needed to see for myself. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down the hallway. The closer I got to the door, the more I felt that cold, creeping dread, the same feeling I had gotten every time I walked past that room before. The door was still open when I reached it. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it fully open, shining my flashlight inside. The room was empty. There was nothing inside except for old furniture covered in sheets. The walls were bare, and the floor was dusty. It didn't make sense. What had I seen on the camera? There was no figure here, nothing that even resembled what I had seen. The room felt eerily quiet, almost like it was holding its breath. I couldn't explain it. My mind raced, trying to find any logical explanation. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, the shadows playing tricks on me. Maybe the door had been slightly ajar when I went to bed, and the camera had just caught it moving a little more. But then something caught my eye, a small object on the floor near the center of the room. I walked over, careful not to disturb anything. It was a key. It looked old, rusted, and had a peculiar engraving on it, something I didn't recognize. It wasn't the same as the keys to the rest of the house. I picked it up, my fingers shaking. What was this key for? And why had it appeared now, after all this time? I put the key in my pocket and left the room, my mind swirling with questions. I didn't know what to think anymore. It felt like the house was trying to tell me something, but I didn't know what. That night, I set up the camera again. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to capture, but I had to know. The key weighed heavily in my pocket, and I knew I had to find out what it opened. This time, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, watching the footage live on my phone. The camera was still positioned in the hallway, facing the door to the small room. The lights were out, and the house was quiet, almost too quiet. Around 2 a.m., something happened. The door, which had been closed when I set up the camera, slowly began to creak open. I could see the faint flicker of the door moving on the screen. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. I was trembling, but I forced myself to open the door. When I did, the room was no different. Nothing had changed. The key I had found earlier was still in my pocket, and there was no sign of any figure standing in the doorway. But then, I heard something. A whisper, barely audible, coming from inside the room. I couldn't make out the words, but it was there. I stepped into the room, and as I did, the temperature dropped drastically. It felt like stepping into a freezer, and I could see my breath in the air. I turned on the flashlight, scanning the room. There was nothing there. No figure. No explanation. Just silence. And then, the camera caught something else. A reflection in the glass of the window, just to the side of the door. In that reflection, I saw it. The figure. It was standing just behind me, watching me from the dark corner of the room. I turned around, but when I did, the figure was gone. There was nothing there but the empty room. I ran out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I couldn't stay there any longer. My head was spinning, and I could barely breathe. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back in that room. I left the house that night, taking only the key and the footage with me. I never went back to that place. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the eerie silence, and the figure that seemed to move in and out of the shadows. I still have the key, locked away in a drawer. I don't know what it opens. I don't know if I ever want to find out. I had never believed in ghosts. Sure, I'd heard stories. Everyone had. Friends, family members, and even strangers would share their tales of haunted houses or eerie encounters, but I always chalked it up to overactive imaginations or exaggerations. There was no such thing as ghosts, I'd tell myself. Nothing could convince me otherwise. That was until the night I moved into my new house. It wasn't exactly a dream home, but it was mine. A small, two-bedroom cottage at the edge of town, tucked away from the bustle of city life. It had a lovely garden and a cozy fireplace. The paint on the walls was chipping in a few places, and the floorboards creaked, but it had character. The price was right, and it felt like a good place to settle down after moving out of my parents' house. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfectly normal. I settled in, unpacked my things, and got used to the quiet. The neighborhood was peaceful, and there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. However, around the third week, I started noticing small, strange things. It began with a strange sound. Every night, around 3 a.m., I would hear soft footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, maybe a raccoon running across the roof. But when the sound continued every night, I grew curious. One night, I decided to stay up and investigate. I placed my camera on the nightstand, hoping to capture whatever it was that made the noise. As I lay in bed, I listened carefully. Sure enough, just after 3 a.m., I heard the soft padding of feet across the floor. My heart raced, but I stayed still, trying to stay calm. I grabbed my phone and quickly checked the live feed from the camera I had set up. The screen was black, and I thought maybe the camera had malfunctioned. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the live feed, just outside the door, there was a shadow, faint at first, but growing more defined. It looked like the silhouette of a person standing just out of view, but the figure was unnaturally still, almost like it was waiting. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure what I was seeing. I turned off the camera and rushed to open the door, but when I did, the hallway was empty. There was no one there. The house was silent. I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. I returned to my bedroom and replayed the footage. The shadow was still there, standing just outside my door. But when I looked back, it was gone. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I walked down the hallway, I felt as though I was being watched, but I tried to brush it off. After all, it could just be my mind playing tricks on me. Then things started to get stranger. The next incident happened about a week later. I had been spending most of the evening working on my computer, and as usual, the house was quiet. It was nearly midnight when I decided to head to bed. As I passed through the living room, I noticed that the light in the hallway was flickering. I assumed it was a faulty bulb and decided to replace it the next day. But as I turned the corner to head upstairs, I felt something cold brush against my skin. It was so cold, it made me stop in my tracks. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the corner of my eye. I didn't wait to investigate. I bolted up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. When I reached my room, I locked the door behind me and immediately turned on the camera, just to be sure. I didn't know why, but I felt like I needed to capture whatever was happening. The camera was set up to record in the hallway. As I lay in bed, the soft buzzing of the camera monitor echoed in the room. I was trying to calm myself, but I couldn't ignore the sense of dread building in my stomach. Around 2:45 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, closer, and seemed to be moving toward my room. I grabbed my phone and checked the footage. My blood ran cold. In the hallway, just outside my door, the figure was there again. It was harder to see this time, almost like it was blending into the shadows, but I could make out its shape. The figure was tall and thin, its features indiscernible, but what made my stomach churn was the way it moved. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, slowly, almost as though it was hovering just above the ground. I could see the faint outline of a face now, pale, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. I almost dropped my phone in shock. As if sensing my fear, the figure slowly raised its hand and reached toward the camera. I felt the air grow even colder, and the footsteps grew louder, as though it was coming closer. My mind raced. I didn't know what to do. My body was frozen. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't look away from the screen. The figure's hand stopped just inches from the camera, and then, in an instant, it was gone. I rushed out of bed, my hands trembling, and opened the door. The hallway was empty. There was no figure, no sign of anyone being there. But when I checked the footage, I saw something that made me feel even more unsettled. On the camera feed, the figure was still there, standing in the hallway, only it wasn't visible to the naked eye. The camera had caught it, its long, bony fingers stretched out toward the lens, its face staring into the camera with those hollow eyes. I didn't know how to explain what I had seen, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I decided to take the footage to a friend, someone I trusted, to get their opinion. When I showed my friend the video, they were just as shocked as I was. We watched it together, and even they could see the figure clearly on the screen. My friend suggested we try to get rid of whatever presence was haunting the house. We called in a local paranormal investigator who specialized in situations like mine. The investigator came over the next day, bringing with him a set of tools, cameras, EVP recorders, and other equipment used to detect spirits. He explained that the house had a long history, and there had been multiple owners over the years. The most recent owner had left abruptly, and no one knew why. It was possible, he said, that something from the past was still lingering in the house. We set up the equipment in the living room and the hallway, and as the night grew darker, we waited for something to happen. The investigator spoke softly, using his tools to scan for any signs of paranormal activity. The air grew heavier, and I could feel the presence of something in the house, but I couldn't see it. It wasn't until around 3 a.m. that we got our first real sign. The EVP recorder picked up a faint whisper. I couldn't hear it at first, but when we played it back, we all froze. The voice on the recording was faint, but it was unmistakable. It said, "I'm here." We all jumped at the sound, but then, as if on cue, the door at the end of the hallway slowly creaked open. The figure was there again, standing in the shadows. This time, it was clearer than ever. Its hollow eyes, its grotesque smile, and its outstretched hand, all captured on camera. The investigator moved quickly, performing a ritual to cleanse the house, but the figure didn't disappear immediately. It lingered for a long moment, watching us, before finally fading away into the darkness. I didn't stay in the house much longer after that. It felt as if the house had become a prison, and no matter how many rituals or protections I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. I moved out, leaving the footage behind, and never looked back. To this day, I still can't explain what I saw. The house has since been sold again, and I wonder if anyone else has experienced what I did. I'll never forget the figure that stood in the shadows, watching me with those hollow eyes, and the feeling that someone, was waiting for me. And whenever I hear footsteps in the dead of night, I can't help but wonder if the unseen visitor is still out there, waiting to return. I've always been a light sleeper. I can hear every creak of the floorboards, the faint hum of a distant car passing by, and even the whisper of the wind outside. I've lived in the same apartment for years, and I've gotten used to the little quirks of the building. It was a quiet place, nothing extraordinary, until that one night when everything changed. It all started about a month ago when a new neighbor moved in next door. Her name was Emily, and from the moment I saw her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She was polite, always smiling, but there was something about her eyes that seemed distant, as if she wasn't fully there. The apartment next to mine had been vacant for a while, and the silence had always been comforting to me. But when Emily moved in, it felt like that peace was disrupted. The first few days were normal. She'd go to work during the day, and I wouldn't hear much from her. But by the second week, things started to get strange. Every night, without fail, I could hear sounds coming from her apartment. At first, I thought maybe she was just adjusting to the place, moving furniture around or unpacking. But the noises didn't stop. It sounded like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor, followed by what seemed like frantic footsteps, pacing back and forth, always at odd hours of the night. I decided to be a good neighbor and knocked on her door one evening, hoping to introduce myself and maybe find out what was going on. Emily answered almost immediately, her smile wide but a little too forced. Her apartment was dark, and I couldn't help but notice how cold it felt inside, even though it was a warm evening. "Oh, hey," she said. "Sorry if I've been a little noisy. I've just been rearranging things. I'll keep it down." I smiled and assured her it was no big deal. After all, everyone has their own way of settling in. But the next night, the sounds continued, only this time it was even worse. The dragging of furniture grew louder, and the footsteps became frantic. I could even hear what sounded like something heavy being dropped, followed by a strange, guttural sound. I didn't know what to make of it, but it was hard to ignore. The next morning, I decided to call the building manager and ask if there had been any complaints. I was curious if Emily had said anything, but to my surprise, the manager hadn't heard a thing about her or the strange noises. In fact, he said she had been living there alone for the past few weeks without any issues. That night, I decided to do something a little more drastic. I set up a camera in my living room, aiming it directly at the wall that separated my apartment from Emily's. My idea was to catch whatever was going on through the night. I knew I couldn't sleep if I kept hearing those sounds, but maybe, just maybe, I could get a clue as to what was happening. Around midnight, the noises started again. First, the dragging of furniture, then the pacing. I was wide awake, my heart racing, as I watched the camera feed on my phone. The sounds were growing louder, and I could even hear a low whisper, like someone was muttering to themselves. But when I checked the camera footage, my blood ran cold. There was no one in Emily's apartment. The room next door appeared empty. The camera feed showed the blank wall. No movement, no shadows, nothing. But I could hear it all. The dragging, the footsteps, the whispers. It was as if something invisible was moving around in her apartment, but no one was there. I was both terrified and confused. I turned off the camera and grabbed my phone to call her. I wanted to make sure she was okay, but when I dialed her number, it went straight to voicemail. I couldn't understand what was happening. My logical mind told me it had to be a malfunction or some trick of the mind. Maybe I was just imagining things. But then, something even stranger happened. The next morning, I went out for my usual walk to clear my head. When I came back, the door to Emily's apartment was wide open. It was strange, because I knew she worked late, and I had never seen her leave it unlocked. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a peek inside, just to make sure everything was okay. I walked into the dark apartment, and the first thing I noticed was the overwhelming coldness. It was as if the air had been frozen in time. The apartment itself was sparse, with minimal furniture. It was almost as though she had just moved in, but everything looked out of place, almost like it was abandoned. I called out for Emily, but there was no response. The apartment seemed unnaturally quiet. I checked every room, and it wasn't until I reached the bedroom that I saw something that made my blood run cold. The bed was made, but there were deep scratches on the floor around it. As I knelt down to inspect it, I noticed something small on the ground, a little piece of paper. I picked it up, and it was a note, written in a frantic scrawl. "I can't escape. It's always watching. Please help me." My heart began to race. The handwriting was erratic, and the message was chilling. Who had written it? Emily? Or someone else? I quickly left the apartment and called the building manager, asking him to check on her. I had to know what was going on, but when he arrived, Emily was nowhere to be found. The apartment was empty, just as I had left it, but it felt even colder now, as if it had been abandoned for years. The manager assured me that Emily had left in the middle of the night, but there was no sign of her anywhere. There were no records of her moving out, no forwarding address, nothing. I was left standing there, feeling both helpless and terrified. The following days were eerily quiet. There were no more sounds coming from the apartment next door, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I thought about the note I had found in her room. It haunted me. Had she been trying to warn me about something? And if so, what had she been running from? I decided to check the camera footage again, hoping to find more answers. I wanted to see if there was anything I had missed. I reviewed the footage from the night I had set the camera up, and my eyes widened in horror when I saw something I hadn't noticed before. In the footage, at the exact moment I had heard the dragging noises and whispers, a figure appeared on the screen. It was faint at first, like a shadow creeping across the wall. But as the camera zoomed in, I saw it more clearly. It was a tall, gaunt figure with hollow, black eyes. Its body seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like it was being distorted by some kind of interference. It was standing in Emily's apartment, right where I had seen the strange movements. And then, the figure turned toward the camera, its eyes locking onto mine. I immediately stopped the footage and backed away from my phone. My stomach was in knots. I couldn't breathe. The figure in the video wasn't human. It couldn't have been. It was as if something malevolent had taken residence in the apartment, and it had been watching me this whole time. I don't know what happened to Emily. I never saw her again after that night, and I don't know if she's okay. All I know is that whatever was in her apartment followed her, and whatever it was, it's still out there. I moved out of the building shortly after that, but the memory of those black eyes haunts me to this day. Every time I hear the floorboards creak, or catch a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I can't help but wonder if the figure has followed me, too. And I still wonder, was Emily trying to warn me, or had she been its victim all along? There's only one thing I know for sure. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, and I'll never be the same after what I saw on that camera. I've always been a skeptic when it came to the supernatural. Growing up, I'd hear people tell stories about ghosts, spirits, and strange happenings, but I never gave it much thought. I was a logical person. Things could be explained away, and I didn't believe in anything I couldn't see or touch. But that all changed one night when something I couldn't explain happened to me, and it was caught on camera. It was a quiet Thursday evening, and I had just returned home from work. I had moved into an older apartment building a few months prior, a place that had a lot of character. The floors creaked, the walls were thin, and the pipes often made strange noises, but it had a certain charm. The neighbors were nice, and it was affordable, perfect for a single guy like me. My apartment was small, with just enough room for a couch, a TV, and a modest kitchen. The bathroom had a mirror above the sink that I had never thought much about until that night. It was about 11:30 p.m. when I finished dinner and decided to unwind in front of the TV. The apartment was completely dark, save for the soft glow of the television. I wasn't tired, but I knew I should get to bed soon since I had an early morning the next day. As I got up to grab a drink of water, I walked past the bathroom door. The light was off, but for some reason, I stopped in my tracks. The mirror in the bathroom caught my eye. It was framed in dark wood and slightly smudged, but it looked ordinary enough. Still, I felt a strange pull towards it. I had this odd sensation that something was watching me through the reflection. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the late hour getting to me. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a glass, and poured myself some water. But just as I turned around to go back to the living room, I froze. I heard a faint noise coming from the bathroom. It was subtle, but it sounded like something was shifting or moving in there. I stood still for a moment, my mind racing. Maybe it was just the pipes acting up, or maybe the wind was rattling something outside. But the sound came again, louder this time, like the soft scrape of something being dragged across the floor. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked back to the bathroom, slowly opening the door, but when I looked inside, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The room was empty, save for the reflection in the mirror. The light was still off, and the mirror seemed to shimmer for just a second, almost as though something was moving behind it. I shrugged it off and turned to leave, but as I did, I caught something in the corner of my eye. My reflection, or at least what I thought was my reflection. It was different. For a split second, I saw a shadow standing behind me in the mirror, a dark, blurry figure with no features, just a dark mass. It was only there for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I quickly turned back around, but the bathroom was still empty. I stared at my reflection in the mirror for what felt like forever, my pulse racing. Nothing else appeared, just my own face, pale in the dim light. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The tiredness, the stress from work, the late hour. It all must have been messing with my head. I wasn't a believer in ghosts or spirits, and there had to be a rational explanation for what I had seen. I grabbed my phone and snapped a quick picture of the mirror, just in case. The image came out blurry, but there was nothing in the reflection that stood out. I felt a little foolish, but told myself to forget about it. I went back to the living room and sat down, trying to focus on the show I had been watching. But something didn't feel right. The air in the apartment felt colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't long before I started hearing faint noises coming from the bathroom again. This time, it sounded like something, or someone, was breathing. I froze in my seat, my body tense, straining to hear. The breathing was faint but rhythmic, like someone was standing just on the other side of the door, taking slow, deliberate breaths. I didn't want to investigate. I really didn't. But my curiosity got the best of me again. I stood up and walked cautiously toward the bathroom. The door was still closed, and the sounds were still there, faint and slow, almost too quiet to catch. I slowly opened the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The bathroom was just as I had left it, except for one thing. The mirror. It was different. It wasn't facing the way it had been before. It had been angled slightly to the side, as though someone had moved it. But there was no one in the room. I stared at the mirror, my breath coming in short gasps. I was about to turn away when I saw it again. That same dark figure in the reflection. This time, it was clearer, standing behind me, its form more defined. But it wasn't a reflection of me. It was something else, something darker. Its shape was unnatural, like it was made of smoke or shadow. Its edges blurred and rippled, as if it were struggling to maintain its form. Before I could move, the figure in the mirror suddenly seemed to lurch toward me, its hands reaching out, its face contorted in a twisted, silent scream. I screamed myself, stumbling backward and slamming the door shut behind me. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone. I quickly snapped a few pictures of the mirror, hoping to capture whatever was happening. The photos were blurry, just like the first one, but there was something different about them. In the first image, I could clearly see the outline of the figure's hand pressed against the mirror. In the second, the figure was closer, its face nearly touching the glass. And in the final photo, it was as if the figure had become one with the reflection, its form bleeding into the glass itself. I had to get out of there. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket, my keys, and ran out the door into the cold night air. I didn't know where I was going, but I just needed to escape the apartment. I didn't care if it was just my imagination or if I had been hallucinating. Something was in there, something that I couldn't explain, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out. The next day, I returned to the apartment with a friend, someone I trusted. I didn't want to go back alone, but I also needed answers. We went through the apartment together, checking every room, looking for any sign of what had happened. The bathroom was empty, and the mirror was back to its normal position. I showed my friend the pictures I had taken the night before. She was skeptical at first, but when she saw the images of the shadowy figure, her face turned pale. She agreed that something wasn't right, but she didn't know what to make of it either. We decided to take the photos to a local paranormal investigator, someone who had experience dealing with strange occurrences. He reviewed the pictures and listened to my story, but his face remained unreadable. After a long pause, he said something that chilled me to the bone. The shadow in the mirror. It's not just a reflection. It's something that's attached itself to you. He explained that mirrors had long been believed to be portals between worlds, and that sometimes dark entities could attach themselves to a person through the reflection. He also mentioned that such things often remained unnoticed until something triggered them, like a move to a new place, a change in routine, or even stress. I don't know what happened that night or what I saw in the bathroom mirror. I don't know if it was a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me, or if something truly supernatural had occurred. But I do know one thing. After that night, I could never look at mirrors the same way again. I moved out of that apartment not long after, and I never went back. I don't know if the shadow followed me or if it stayed behind in that old building, but I'm not willing to find out. To this day, I avoid mirrors in the dark, and I always make sure to keep the bathroom light on before I go to bed. And every once in a while, when I glance into a mirror, I wonder, is something still there, watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move? I suppose I'll never really know. It all started about a month ago when my cousin Andrew asked me to house sit for him. He just moved into a big, old house on the outskirts of town, and he wanted to go on a short holiday with his family to relax. The house was huge, and I must admit, it was a bit intimidating. The dark, wooden floors, the antique furniture, and the tall, narrow windows. It felt like something out of an old horror movie. Andrew mentioned that there was an old web camera in the living room that he used to monitor the house remotely while he was away. I had never used a web camera for something like this before, but he assured me it was nothing out of the ordinary. The camera was set up to record whenever it detected motion, so it would be a good way for him to check in on the house when he wasn't there. The first few days were uneventful. I watched TV, cooked, cleaned up, and explored the house during the day. Everything seemed fine, but then something strange started happening during the night. I remember it clearly because it was a bitterly cold night. The wind howled outside, and I was already a bit uneasy from the shadows of the old house. At around 2 a.m., I heard a soft noise coming from the living room, just like a low click. I froze, thinking it was just the wind moving something, or perhaps a random noise from the old heating system. I turned my attention back to the movie I was watching, but I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling. Something seemed off. I reached for my phone to check the time, and that's when I noticed that the web camera light was on. The camera was active, as if it had just started recording. But why? I hadn't triggered it, and there was nothing unusual in the living room. Curious, I clicked through the footage saved on the computer, which was linked to the camera. I quickly skipped past a lot of motionless hours until I came across the recording from a few minutes before, and what I saw made my blood run cold. In the video, I could clearly see a figure moving around in the living room. It was a dark, shadowy figure, almost like a human shape, but it wasn't quite right. The figure moved unnaturally, jerking and twitching, as if it wasn't fully solid. I watched, bewildered, as the figure seemed to be inspecting the furniture, walking around the room, and sometimes just standing still, staring into nothing. The most bizarre part was that the figure's movements were synchronized with mine. If I moved my head, the shadow did the same, almost like a reflection, but it wasn't in a mirror. It was in the camera. I watched in horror as the figure continued to pace, looking over every detail in the living room. And then, something strange happened. The figure looked straight into the camera lens, staring at me. Its hollow, dark eyes locked onto mine. For a split second, I swear, I saw a slight smirk on its shadowy face. I quickly closed the video, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to check the camera for some technical malfunction, but there was no evidence of anything wrong. The camera was still recording, the light on, showing a perfectly normal, empty room. I replayed the footage several times, but it remained the same. Just a shadowy figure, doing weird things, staring at the camera, and staring at me. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. The figure kept haunting me. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, staring at me with a strange, almost sinister glimmer. I wondered if I had just imagined things, but the recording on the computer said otherwise. The next morning, I checked the web camera again. It was still on, still recording, but the room appeared empty. I searched every inch of the house for any trace of that figure, but I found nothing. It seemed like it had vanished overnight. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Over the next few nights, the camera would suddenly activate for a few minutes at odd times. Every time, it would capture the same figure. It would appear, move around, look into the camera, and then just disappear. The recordings were always the same. No changes, no differences. I kept showing them to myself, trying to find some explanation, some glitch, something that would reassure me. But there was nothing. I began to notice other strange things happening around the house. It wasn't just the camera anymore. Objects would move around on their own, even though I was the only one there. Books would slide off the shelves. The lights flickered for no reason, and once, I heard a voice whispering something incomprehensible from the corner of the living room. I would look, but of course, there was nothing there. One night, I finally decided to sit and talk to the camera. I needed to know why it was showing me this figure, what it wanted. I said out loud, "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" Silence. The camera stayed on, recording a completely still room. Then, just as I was about to give up, something weird happened. The image on the camera screen started to distort. The shadowy figure appeared again, but this time, it was different. It seemed to be flickering, blending in and out of the frame, more fluid than ever. Its features seemed to change constantly. Sometimes it would be a tall man with a hat. Other times, it would appear as a hunched old woman. The figure whispered, "You can see me." I jumped up, nearly knocking over the camera. My heart was racing, my eyes fixed on the screen. The figure's voice sounded almost familiar, like it was trying to imitate mine. Who are you?" I stammered. The figure just smirked again, cocking its head as if to study me. It didn't say anything else, but I could still hear its voice echoing in my mind. The rest of the night was a blur of shadows, strange noises, and a cold sweat. The camera kept recording, showing nothing but an empty room, but I could swear I saw the figure's eyes following me through the screen. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even breathe without feeling like something was pressing down on me. The atmosphere of the house had changed, become darker, more sinister. I couldn't stay here anymore. I packed up my things and left, unable to take it anymore. I haven't been able to explain what happened, and I don't think I ever will. The figure on the camera still shows up sometimes, always at odd times, always staring at me. I wonder if Andrew ever sees it when he checks his house remotely. I never found out what the figure wanted, or why it appeared. But one thing's for sure. I'll never forget the look in those eyes, dark, hollow, yet somehow knowing. And I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, even when no one else is there. I never believed in ghosts. I thought the idea of spirits lingering in the world was something people created to explain the things they couldn't understand. But that all changed one night when something happened that not only shook me to my core but was also caught on camera. Now, I can't unsee what I witnessed, and every time I close my eyes, I hear those whispers. It all started when I moved into a small house on the edge of town. I was tired of living in apartments, dealing with noisy neighbors, and cramped spaces. This place was perfect, quiet, isolated, and inexpensive. It had a cozy charm, even if it was a little worn down. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and the floors creaked, but I liked it. I'd always loved older houses. They felt full of character and history. I didn't notice anything strange at first. It was just a regular house with regular sounds. But after a couple of weeks, I began to feel like I wasn't alone. At night, I would hear faint footsteps upstairs when I knew no one else was in the house. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering, low and muffled, like someone was talking just out of earshot. I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe the wind creaking through the walls. That all changed when I bought a security camera system. I had gotten tired of the unsettling noises and wanted to set up cameras in the main areas of the house, just in case there was an explanation for the strange occurrences. I figured maybe the house was just old, and the creaks and whispers could be explained by wind or plumbing issues. But once the cameras were installed, that's when things started getting much worse. The first night, everything seemed normal. I checked the footage before going to bed. The living room camera showed an empty room with no movement. I felt a little silly for being so jumpy, but I was relieved that nothing unusual had been caught. I went to bed, thinking that maybe I had been imagining things. The next morning, I checked the footage from the previous night, just to see if anything odd had happened while I was asleep. At first, it seemed like the same footage. Empty rooms, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, in the corner of the living room, I saw something strange. A face. It appeared for just a fraction of a second, then vanished as quickly as it came. It was blurry, but I could clearly see the outline of a face, staring directly at the camera. It was a woman's face, pale with hollow eyes, and she had an expression of quiet sorrow. I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse. I rewound the video and played it again. The face was there, but this time, I could make out more detail. Her features were sharp, gaunt, as if she hadn't eaten in days. The expression on her face wasn't one of anger or fear. No, it was something far more chilling. It was a sadness, like a deep, unshakable sorrow. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stared at the face, unsure of what to do. I turned off the computer and tried to brush it off. I told myself it was probably just a glitch, maybe some light catching on the lens in a weird way, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to check the footage one more time that evening, just to ease my nerves. This time, the footage was even worse. The woman's face wasn't the only thing on the camera. As I watched the screen, I saw several other figures standing behind her, all wearing old-fashioned clothing. There were men and women, some standing in the shadows, others standing closer to the camera, their faces faint but still visible. The same sorrowful look filled their expressions, as if they were trapped in a never-ending cycle of grief. I felt a pit form in my stomach as I watched the figures. They didn't move. They just stood there, staring into the camera with those empty, sorrowful eyes. I fast-forwarded through the footage, hoping it was just a distortion or malfunction, but the faces remained. Every time I played the video, I saw them. A crowd of silent, weeping figures, all watching me. I was too terrified to sleep that night. I kept replaying the footage, each time seeing more and more faces. But the worst part came in the early hours of the morning. The camera, which had been perfectly still, suddenly jerked as if something had physically touched it. The screen flickered, and then, for a moment, everything went black. When the video came back on, the room was empty again, but the whispering started. At first, it was soft, like a distant murmur, but it gradually grew louder. The voices seemed to echo through the walls, whispering in unison. "Help us," they said, over and over, in a chorus of despair. "Help us, please." I couldn't take it anymore. My heart was pounding in my chest as I rushed through the house, checking every corner, every room, but there was nothing there. No faces, no figures, just an empty house. Yet the whispers kept growing louder in my mind, filling my head with their desperate cries. The camera footage showed nothing but empty rooms, but I couldn't ignore what I had heard. I decided to dig into the history of the house, hoping to find some explanation. I visited the local library and combed through old town records. It didn't take long before I found something that made my blood run cold. The house had once belonged to an old family who had mysteriously disappeared. The records were vague, but it seemed that the family had lived in the house for generations. The last known member of the family had been a woman named Eleanor. She had disappeared without a trace, and the house had been abandoned shortly after. There was a note in the archives that mentioned rumors of strange happenings, whispers in the night, faces appearing in windows, and eerie sounds coming from the attic. The more I learned, the more it seemed like the house was haunted by the spirits of the family who had lived there. The faces I had seen on the camera were not random. They were the souls of the people who had once called this house home. But what did they want? Why were they so desperate, so sad? And why were they reaching out to me? Determined to uncover the truth, I set up the camera again, this time in the attic, where the whispers seemed to be coming from. I had to know if there was something more to the story, if there was a connection between the figures and the house itself. That night, I left the camera running and waited. It was just after midnight when the temperature in the room dropped. I could feel the chill in the air, a presence that made every hair on the back of my neck stand up. I watched the screen, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain the strange events. And then, it happened. The faces appeared again, only this time, they were all around me. The camera captured them in the attic, standing in a circle, their hollow eyes staring at the lens. They didn't speak this time. They just stood there, motionless, their eyes never leaving the camera. And in the center of the circle, I saw a new figure. A man, tall and gaunt, with a dark, empty void where his face should be. His body flickered like a shadow, shifting between reality and something else. He stepped forward, closer to the camera, and I heard him speak. His voice wasn't loud, but it wasn't a whisper either. It was clear, cold, and chilling. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "Now you know too much." The camera flickered again, and the video went black. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. I never went back to that house. I packed up my things, and as soon as I could, I left town. I don't know what happened to the family, or why their spirits were trapped in that house, but I know one thing for sure. They're still there, waiting. And the faces will never leave me. Every time I close my eyes, I hear their whispers, pleading for help. I always considered myself a skeptic when it came to the supernatural. I like to think that if something couldn't be explained by science or reason, then it simply didn't exist. But that all changed when I moved into my new apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building in the city. What happened to me there, something that was caught on camera, was beyond any explanation I could come up with, and I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe again. When I first walked into the apartment, I was drawn to it immediately. The building had a unique charm to it, with its creaky floors, exposed brick walls, and vintage fixtures. It had been renovated, but it still retained that classic, old-school feel. I was excited to finally have my own place, away from the busy, cramped city life. The landlord gave me a quick tour of the apartment. It wasn't very big, but it was perfect for a single person. It had an open living room, a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. There were 2 large windows overlooking the city, and it had a cozy feeling to it. The landlord told me that the apartment had been vacant for a while, but there was nothing odd about it. In fact, she seemed eager to rent it out, almost too eager. After I moved in, I settled into a new routine. I'd go to work during the day and spend my nights either reading, watching TV, or relaxing. For the first few days, everything seemed perfectly normal. The apartment was quiet, peaceful, and everything worked well. But that changed after the first week. It started subtly at first, small things I brushed off as coincidences. At night, I'd hear faint noises from the hallway outside my door, but whenever I opened it, there was no one there. The lights in the living room would flicker, and sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find the TV was on, though I was certain I had turned it off. The most unsettling part was when I'd see strange shadows moving across the walls, but every time I went to investigate, nothing was there. I wasn't sure if I was just adjusting to living alone, or if the building had some quirks. But it wasn't long before the events began to escalate. One night, I decided to set up a small security camera in the corner of the living room, just out of curiosity. I wanted to see if I could catch whatever was causing the strange noises and movements. The camera was a small, discreet model that connected to my phone, so I could check the footage later. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I went to bed as usual. I was half asleep when I heard a soft sound coming from the living room, something faint, like a scraping noise. It made me sit up in bed, my heart racing. I tried to ignore it at first, but the noise continued, slow, deliberate, like someone was moving something across the floor. I grabbed my phone and checked the live feed from the camera. My stomach dropped when I saw what was on the screen. The living room was empty, but the shadows on the walls were moving. They weren't from the lights or any objects. They were different. They seemed to pulse, shifting in unnatural ways. It was as if something was standing there, just out of sight of the camera, and the shadows were its movement. I quickly turned off the phone and tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light or a glitch in the camera. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I checked the footage the next morning, hoping it was a mistake. What I saw made my blood run cold. The video showed the living room in perfect clarity, but the shadows were no longer subtle. The dark figures that had been flickering in and out of view were now clearer. They looked like silhouettes of people, tall, thin, and twisted, with elongated limbs. But it was their eyes that haunted me. Their eyes were glowing, an eerie, unnatural red that seemed to burn through the screen. In the footage, one of the figures slowly moved into the frame, standing still for several seconds. The eyes, those glowing eyes, were locked onto the camera lens, staring directly at me. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was as if the figure knew I was watching, like it was staring straight into my soul. I watched the video again and again, but each time, the same figure appeared. Standing in the same spot, its eyes fixed on the camera. I couldn't explain it. The figure wasn't visible to the naked eye, but the camera had clearly caught it. My hands trembled as I replayed the footage. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was something real, something I couldn't explain. The next few nights were even worse. I kept the camera running, unable to stop myself. Every time I checked the footage, I saw more figures, each one more defined, more terrifying. They would stand in the corners of the living room, their eyes glowing in the darkness. But what really chilled me to the bone was that the figures weren't always in the same place. They moved. They would shift around the room, walking with slow, deliberate steps. And always, their eyes would follow the camera, watching me. The whispers started soon after. At first, they were soft, like distant voices coming from the other side of the wall. But then, they began to grow louder. I could hear them clearly in the dead of night, echoing through the empty apartment. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a low, menacing whisper, almost like a chant. I could no longer sleep. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the voices in the walls. Sometimes, I would catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The shadows on the walls grew longer, darker, until they seemed to stretch across the room, engulfing everything in their path. One night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. I turned off all the lights, armed myself with a flashlight, and went into the living room. I stood there, waiting for something to happen. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I felt a cold draft sweep across the room, and the temperature dropped suddenly. I shivered, but I didn't move. Then, I saw it. The shadows on the walls began to shift again, and the figures emerged. They stepped into the light, their glowing eyes staring at me. I could see them more clearly now. Tall, thin figures, their faces gaunt and hollow. Their skin was stretched tight over their bones, and their mouths hung open, as if they were waiting for something. Waiting for me. The whispers grew louder, and the figures slowly began to move toward me. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. I raised the flashlight, shining it toward them, but the light flickered and went out. In that moment, everything went dark. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on the floor, trembling. The apartment was quiet again. The figures were gone. The whispers had stopped. But when I checked the camera footage, it was worse than I could have imagined. The figures were all around me. They were standing in every corner of the living room, staring at me with those glowing red eyes. And there, in the center of the room, was the worst one, the tall figure with the hollow face. It was no longer standing still. It was moving toward the camera, its eyes fixed on me. Its mouth opened wide, as if it was about to speak. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and left that night. I didn't even bother to turn off the camera. I just ran, not looking back. I don't know what I saw in that apartment, whether it was a haunting, an illusion, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. Those eyes are still with me. Every time I close my eyes, I see them, glowing, burning, staring at me from the darkness, and I can't escape them. I've always been someone who prefers a quiet life. I'm not one for parties or big social gatherings, and I certainly wasn't looking for anything out of the ordinary when I moved into my new apartment. It was small but cozy, and the rent was reasonable for the area. The building itself was old, but that didn't bother me. I liked older buildings. They had a history to them. Little did I know, the history of this place would change my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. It all started when I moved in. The apartment was on the second floor of an old brick building with wooden floors and antique fixtures. There was a strange charm about the place, even though it creaked with every step I took. I liked the feeling of living somewhere with character, so I was eager to settle in. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. I spent my days at work and my nights at home, watching TV, reading, and just unwinding. But it didn't take long before I began to notice little things that didn't sit right with me. At first, I tried to dismiss them as coincidence, but they kept happening. It started with the mirrors. I've always had mirrors in my home, and nothing unusual had ever happened with them before. But in this apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were different. I would pass by one and catch a glimpse of something moving in the reflection, just a flicker at the edge of the mirror, something that shouldn't have been there. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but it happened so often that I began to question it. One evening, I decided to try and get to the bottom of it. I placed my phone on a table in front of the bathroom mirror and started filming, just to see if I could catch whatever was causing the weird reflections. I wasn't expecting much, just a quick test to ease my nerves. As the video began, I stood still in front of the mirror, checking my appearance, when something caught my eye. In the reflection, there was a figure standing just behind me. I froze. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The room was empty. My heart began to race as I replayed the video, searching for some explanation. I saw it again. A shadowy figure, tall and thin, standing right behind me in the mirror. It didn't make sense. I was alone in the apartment, and I had been facing the mirror the whole time. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but I could clearly see the figure on the video. It had no discernible features, just a vague outline of a person. I watched it again and again, trying to figure out what was going on, but each time, the figure was still there, its presence impossible to ignore. At first, I convinced myself that it was just a trick of the light or a reflection of something outside the window. But the more I thought about it, the less I could believe that explanation. I had lived in plenty of places before, and I had never experienced anything like this. There was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences intensified. I started noticing more shadows in the corners of my vision, shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I heard faint sounds at night, scratching, tapping, and even whispers, coming from the walls. The odd part was that I couldn't locate the source of these sounds. It was as if they were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. One evening, I decided to do something I never thought I would. I set up a security camera. I didn't want to believe in ghosts or anything paranormal, but the constant unease was starting to get to me. I needed proof, something concrete that I could either disprove or confront. I placed the camera facing the bathroom mirror, hoping to capture something, anything, that could explain the strange events. That night, I went to bed, determined to sleep through whatever might happen. I was exhausted from the constant stress and the strange happenings that seemed to escalate with every passing day. But my exhaustion didn't prevent me from waking up to an unsettling noise around 3 a.m. I sat up in bed, heart pounding in my chest. I could hear someone moving around in the apartment. I didn't know if I was just imagining it, or if there really was someone else there. Slowly, I grabbed my phone and checked the footage from the camera. What I saw made my blood run cold. The video showed the bathroom mirror as usual, but this time, the figure was more distinct. The tall, thin shape was standing directly behind me, no longer a shadow, but fully visible. Its outline was clearer, though still distorted and blurry. But it was the eyes that made me gasp. The eyes were glowing, a deep, unnatural red that seemed to shine through the mirror, fixated on me. And as I stared at the video, I saw the figure slowly move. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it was shifting in and out of existence. But it was getting closer. Every second that passed, the figure came closer to the mirror, its glowing eyes never leaving the reflection of my face. I watched in horror as it moved until it was right behind me in the mirror, standing just inches away. It reached out a long, bony hand, its fingers stretching toward me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I saw the fingers touch the edge of the mirror, just barely brushing the surface. The mirror began to fog up around its touch, and I felt a coldness wash over me, even though the room temperature hadn't changed. I couldn't take it anymore. I shut off my phone and ran out of the apartment. I didn't care about my things, my belongings, or anything else. I just needed to get out. I stayed with a friend for the night, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. The next day, I returned to the apartment, though I wasn't sure I should. I didn't want to face whatever I had caught on camera, but I had to know. I had to see it again. I checked the video again, hoping I had somehow imagined the whole thing. But when I played it back, the figure was still there. But this time, the figure didn't stay still. It started to move. Slowly, it began to step out of the reflection and into the room with me. Its body flickered, like it wasn't quite a part of the real world. I could see its features more clearly now. Pale skin, a long, twisted face, and eyes that burned with an unnatural light. The figure reached out, its hand extended toward the camera, and then it spoke. The voice was distorted, as if coming from a deep well or a long tunnel. It sounded hollow, empty, but its words were clear. "You're not alone." The moment it spoke, the camera cut out. The feed went black, and I heard a loud bang from behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. The apartment was silent, the only sound my racing heartbeat. I didn't stay another minute. I packed a bag, grabbed my essentials, and left, abandoning everything else. I didn't care about the apartment anymore. I couldn't stay there, not with the things I had seen and heard. I moved to a new place a few days later, but even now, I can't escape the memory of that figure. I still have the footage saved on my phone, though I rarely watch it. Every time I look at it, I can feel the cold touch of that hand on the mirror, and I hear the distorted voice telling me I'm not alone. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can still feel those eyes watching me, waiting for me to look into a mirror again. But I haven't looked since that night. I haven't dared. I don't know who or what was in that reflection, but I do know this. Some things are better left unseen. When my sister Sarah asked me to babysit her 2-year-old daughter Lily for the weekend, I didn't hesitate to say yes. I loved Lily to pieces and looked forward to spending time with her. Sarah and her husband were heading out of town for an anniversary getaway, and I was happy to help. Their house was modern, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, and equipped with every high-tech gadget imaginable. One of those gadgets was a baby monitor with video and audio capabilities. It connected to an app on my phone, allowing me to check on Lily even if I wasn't in the same room. It was supposed to make things easier, but by the end of that weekend, it became the source of my worst nightmare. The first day passed uneventfully. Lily was her usual bubbly self, laughing and playing with her toys. We spent the day building block towers, reading storybooks, and watching her favorite cartoons. When bedtime rolled around, I tucked her in, turned on her nightlight, a small turtle that projected soft stars onto the ceiling, and kissed her goodnight. I placed the baby monitor on her dresser, ensuring it had a clear view of her crib, then left the room, pulling the door gently behind me. I settled onto the couch with a bowl of popcorn and a horror movie queued up on the TV. I checked the baby monitor feed on my phone periodically, and everything seemed normal. Lily was sound asleep, her little chest rising and falling rhythmically. The night was quiet and uneventful, until it wasn't. It was around midnight when I heard it. I had just turned off the TV and was about to head to bed when a faint sound came from the baby monitor. At first, I thought it was static, but as I grabbed my phone to check, the sound became clearer. It was laughter, soft, high-pitched giggling, like a child's. Confused, I stared at the screen. Lily was still in her crib, lying on her side, her eyes closed. The laughter wasn't coming from her. It echoed faintly through the monitor, like it was somewhere else in the room. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was probably just interference from another monitor in a nearby house, though the logical part of my brain reminded me that this monitor was on a private, encrypted network. I shook it off, blaming exhaustion, and went to bed. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the unease creeping into my chest. Something about that laughter didn't sit right with me. The next day was normal. Lily woke up bright and early, her cheerful giggles filling the house as I made her breakfast. I didn't mention the incident from the night before. Why scare myself over what was probably nothing? We spent the day playing outside, enjoying the sunshine, and by the time evening rolled around, Lily was so tired she fell asleep almost immediately after her bedtime story. I turned on the monitor again and went about my night, this time opting for a light-hearted comedy instead of another horror movie. Everything was fine, until the laughter returned. It was faint at first, barely audible. I froze, my eyes glued to the monitor screen on my phone. Lily was there, sleeping peacefully, but the sound grew louder, clearer. It wasn't just laughter now. It was a voice. A child's voice, whispering. I strained to make out the words, but they were too soft, like they were being spoken just out of earshot. My heart began to race. I turned up the volume on the monitor, trying to hear better, and that's when I saw it. Something moved in the corner of the screen. A shadow. It was small, like a child, and it darted past the crib so quickly I almost thought I had imagined it. But I hadn't. I rewound the footage and played it back, and there it was again. A fleeting shadow, low to the ground, moving unnaturally fast. I bolted up the stairs and into Lily's room, flipping on the light. She stirred but didn't wake, and the room was exactly as I had left it. There was no sign of anyone, or anything else. I checked the closet, under the crib, and even the window, but everything was locked and secure. Feeling uneasy but unwilling to scare myself further, I convinced myself it was a glitch in the monitor's software and went back downstairs. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house felt amplified, every creak of the floorboards like a threat. I kept the monitor feed open on my phone, staring at it as I lay in bed. Around 3 a.m., the whispering started again. This time, it was louder. I could make out fragments of words, though they didn't make sense. It was a child's voice, speaking in a sing-song tone, almost playful. "Come play. In the stars, can't you see?" I stared at the screen, paralyzed. The turtle nightlight cast its soft glow over the room, and the stars danced across the ceiling. But there, in the corner of the crib, was a shape. A dark figure, small and hunched. It didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. It was just there, sitting in the crib with Lily. I felt frozen in place, my mind racing. What was I seeing? Was it a trick of the light? A glitch in the camera? But as I watched, the figure slowly turned its head, and two glowing eyes stared directly into the camera. I dropped my phone in shock, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. When I picked it up again, the screen was static. The feed had cut out. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run upstairs and grab Lily, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. What if whatever was in that room wasn't something I could fight? But the thought of leaving Lily alone with whatever it was spurred me into action. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a heavy candlestick, and crept upstairs, every step feeling like an eternity. When I reached Lily's room, I hesitated outside the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I could hear the faint sound of whispering from inside. Taking a deep breath, I flung the door open and turned on the light. The room was empty. Lily was still in her crib, sleeping soundly, her tiny hand clutching her favorite stuffed animal. But the atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was thicker. I checked the monitor again. The feed was back, and everything appeared normal. There was no sign of the shadowy figure, no glowing eyes, no whispers. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. The rest of the night passed in a tense silence. I stayed in Lily's room, sitting in a chair by the crib, watching over her until morning. When Sarah and her husband returned later that day, I didn't tell them everything. I didn't want to scare them, and honestly, I wasn't sure they'd believe me. Before I left, I checked the monitor footage one last time. Most of it was static, but there was a single clip that sent chills down my spine. It showed Lily's crib, empty except for her, and the shadowy figure standing at the foot of the bed. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at the camera. As I left their house, I couldn't help but glance back at the upstairs window. For a split second, I thought I saw a small figure standing there, watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. Even now, months later, I can't forget what I saw. I don't know what that thing was, but I do know one thing. I'll never look at a baby monitor the same way again. When I moved into my new apartment, I thought it was going to be the start of something great. I had just gotten a promotion, and for the first time in years, I could afford a place all to myself. No more roommates, no more sharing bathrooms or fighting over fridge space. It was perfect. The apartment wasn't anything fancy, just a one-bedroom in an old brick building on the edge of town. The rent was cheap, and the landlord seemed nice enough. Sure, the place had its quirks, creaky floorboards, drafty windows, and the occasional flickering light, but I chalked it up to the building's age. It had charm, Or so I told myself. It didn't take long for me to notice the strange things. At first, they were small, easy to dismiss. Doors that I swore I'd closed would be slightly ajar. Lights I knew I'd turned off would be on when I came home. I blamed my forgetfulness and didn't think much of it. But then, things started escalating. One evening, I was unpacking some boxes in the living room when I heard a soft thud coming from the bedroom. I froze, my hands still clutching a stack of books. The sound had been faint but distinct, like something heavy had fallen. Probably nothing, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease. I walked into the bedroom, expecting to find that I'd left a window open and the wind had knocked something over. But everything was exactly where I'd left it. I shrugged and went back to unpacking, but the sound lingered in the back of my mind. It wasn't the kind of noise an old building made, not a creak or a groan, but a deliberate thump, like something or someone had moved. A few nights later, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it again. This time, it came from the kitchen. It was louder than before, a sharp, deliberate knock that echoed through the apartment. My heart raced as I sat up and listened, straining to hear any other sounds. Probably the neighbors, I whispered, trying to calm myself, but I knew that wasn't true. The walls in the building were thick, and I'd barely heard my neighbors since I'd moved in. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, slowly making my way to the kitchen. The room was empty. Everything was where it should be, and there was no sign of anything or anyone that could have made the noise. I stood there for a while, the beam of my flashlight sweeping over the counters and cabinets, but nothing seemed out of place. I told myself it was just the building settling and went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. It wasn't until I decided to set up a security camera that things really started to spiral. After a particularly unsettling night where I swore I'd heard footsteps in the hallway, I bought a cheap motion-activated camera and set it up in the living room. It was connected to my phone, so I could check the feed anytime, and it sent notifications whenever it detected movement. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. The camera picked up nothing but me coming and going. But one night, as I was sitting on the couch watching TV, my phone buzzed with a notification. Motion detected. I paused the show and opened the app, expecting to see myself in the feed, but the living room was empty. Confused, I rewound the footage. My blood ran cold as I watched the video. The camera showed the living room, dimly lit by the glow of the TV. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, from the corner of the frame, a shadow moved. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was more like a shape, dark and indistinct, shifting across the floor. It moved slowly, deliberately, before disappearing out of view. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I rewound the footage and played it again, but it didn't change. The shadow was there, unmistakable. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Maybe a car had passed by outside, and the headlights had cast a weird shadow. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Over the next few days, the activity grew worse. The camera picked up more shadows, more movement. Sometimes, I'd hear faint whispers when I was alone in the apartment, too quiet to make out but unmistakably there. I started avoiding the living room at night, keeping to my bedroom with the door locked. But even then, I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. One night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. Another motion alert. I almost didn't want to look, but curiosity and fear got the better of me. I opened the app and watched the live feed. The camera showed the living room, as usual, but this time, the shadow wasn't moving. It was standing, in the middle of the room, just standing there. It was tall and thin, its form barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't see any features, just the outline of a figure, completely still. I stared at the screen, too terrified to move. Then, slowly, the shadow began to turn. It didn't have a face, but somehow, I felt its gaze on me. My breath caught in my throat as it started walking toward the camera. The feed cut out. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in bed with the lights on, clutching my phone and waiting for something, anything, to happen. When morning finally came, I decided I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. I packed a bag and left, crashing at a friend's place while I tried to figure out what to do. I considered breaking the lease, but the thought of explaining why to my landlord made me hesitate. "Sorry, but my apartment is haunted," didn't seem like it would go over well. Instead, I decided to set up another camera, this time in my bedroom. If I could gather more footage, maybe I could prove to myself, or someone else, that I wasn't imagining things. The first night back in the apartment, I didn't hear anything unusual. I checked the footage from the bedroom camera the next morning, and everything seemed normal. But the next night, as I was lying in bed, my phone buzzed with another motion alert. I opened the app, and my heart sank. The video showed my bedroom, dimly lit by the lamp on my nightstand. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. I hadn't heard it move, but the camera caught it. The door opened just a crack, enough for a shadow to slip through. The figure from the living room entered the frame, its dark form barely visible against the light. It moved to the foot of my bed and stopped, standing there silently. And then it spoke. The voice was low and distorted, like it was coming from a broken speaker. "You can't leave," it said. "This is my home." I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. When I looked back at the screen, the figure was gone, and the feed was blank. I left the apartment that day and never went back. I called the landlord, made up some excuse about a family emergency, and broke the lease. I left most of my things behind, not caring about the cost of replacing them. I just wanted to be gone. To this day, I don't know what I experienced in that apartment. Was it a ghost? A demon? Something else entirely? I don't know, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that whatever it wasn't human, and it didn't want me there. Even now, months later, I sometimes feel like I'm being watched. When I'm alone at night, I hear faint whispers, too quiet to understand but loud enough to remind me of what I left behind. I've stopped using cameras in my home. I don't want to know what's out there, waiting in the shadows. It all started with an old family tradition. Every summer, my cousins and I would spend a week at our grandparents' farmhouse. The house was ancient, its walls steeped in history and secrets. For as long as I could remember, it had been our haven, a place filled with laughter, homemade pies, and the kind of warmth that only a grandparent's home can offer. But there was one part of the house we were told never to go near. The staircase to the attic. The door to the staircase was always locked, and Grandpa made it clear that it was off limits. "That attic hasn't been opened in decades," he'd say. "It's old and unsafe." We never questioned it. Kids are good at obeying when the rules come from someone they trust, and besides, there were plenty of other places in the house to explore. But as we grew older, our curiosity grew stronger. By the time I was 17, I couldn't stop wondering what was behind that locked door. It was the summer of my senior year when everything changed. My cousins couldn't make it that year, so I spent the week at the farmhouse alone with my grandparents. On the second night, as I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, I heard a sound that sent chills down my spine. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a soft creak, like footsteps on wood. I froze, holding my breath to listen. The sound grew louder, coming from the hallway. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m. My grandparents were sound sleepers, and I couldn't imagine them wandering around at this hour. Grabbing my phone, I crept out of bed and into the hall. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the curtains. The footsteps had stopped, but my eyes were drawn to the attic door. It was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest. That door was always locked. I'd never seen it open in all the years I'd been coming here. Slowly, I approached, the floorboards creaking under my feet. I pushed the door open wider, revealing the narrow staircase beyond. It was pitch black, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow light. I hesitated, my hand trembling on the railing. Every instinct told me to turn around, to wake my grandparents, but something compelled me to keep going. I turned on my phone's flashlight and started up the stairs. The attic was larger than I expected, its ceiling sloping with the shape of the roof. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung like curtains. Old trunks and furniture were scattered around, relics of a forgotten era. But what caught my attention was a small table in the center of the room, with something sitting on top. It was a camera, an old, bulky camcorder, the kind that used VHS tapes. Next to it was a stack of tapes, each labeled with a date in faded handwriting. The dates ranged from the late 1980s to the early 1990s, all long before I was born. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the camera, brushing off a layer of dust, and found that it still had a tape inside. I didn't have a way to play it, but I knew my grandparents had an old VCR in the living room. As I turned to leave, I heard it, the sound of footsteps on the stairs. My breath caught in my throat. The light from my phone illuminated the staircase, but there was no one there. The sound grew louder, the steps deliberate and heavy, but the staircase remained empty. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Clutching the camera, I bolted down the stairs, slamming the attic door shut behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the living room with the camera and tapes, trying to make sense of what I'd found. When the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, I finally worked up the nerve to play the tape. The footage was grainy and shaky, the kind of home video that felt eerily intimate. It showed the attic, though it looked much cleaner and more organized than it did now. A woman appeared on screen, smiling at the camera as she dusted off an old trunk. I didn't recognize her, but something about her seemed familiar. Her dark hair, her sharp features. She was beautiful, but there was a sadness in her eyes. The tape went on for several minutes, showing the woman arranging items in the attic. Then, suddenly, the camera shifted and the screen filled with static. When the picture returned, the tone had changed. The woman was no longer smiling. She stood in the corner of the attic, her back to the camera, her shoulders hunched. She was whispering, though I couldn't make out the words. As I watched, my skin prickled. The camera seemed to move on its own, zooming in closer to the woman. She turned, slowly, and looked directly at the lens. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her mouth moved rapidly as if she were speaking, but there was no sound. Then the screen went black. I played the next tape, and the next. Each one was stranger than the last. They all showed the same woman in the attic, but her behavior grew more erratic. She'd pace back and forth, clutching her head, or sit on the floor rocking back and forth. In one tape, she was holding a doll and singing a lullaby, her voice trembling. The final tape was the worst. The woman was sitting at the table in the attic, the camera focused on her face. She was crying, tears streaming down her cheeks as she muttered something under her breath. Then, she looked directly into the camera and said, "He won't let me leave." The screen cut to static. I couldn't ignore the tapes any longer. I had to know who the woman was and what had happened to her. When my grandparents woke up, I showed them the camera and the tapes. My grandfather's face went pale as he stared at them. "Where did you find these?" he asked, his voice trembling. "In the attic," I said. "Grandpa, who is she?" He didn't answer at first. My grandmother put a hand on his arm, her eyes filled with concern. Finally, he spoke. Her name was Margaret. She lived here before we did. She rented the house with her husband. But something happened to her. Something terrible. He hesitated, as if he didn't want to say the words. Margaret disappeared. The police investigated, but they never found her. Her husband claimed she'd run away, but he trailed off, shaking his head. "Do you think she's still here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My grandfather looked at me, his expression grave. "I don't know, but I locked that attic for a reason." That night, I made the mistake of setting up a motion-activated camera in the attic. I needed answers, even if I was terrified of what I might find. I placed the camera on the table where I'd found the camcorder and left the room, locking the door behind me. The footage was something I'll never forget. At first, the room was still. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by the faint moonlight streaming through the window. Then, around 3 a.m., the camera picked up movement. A shadow appeared in the corner of the room, faint at first but growing darker and more defined. It was her, Margaret. She stood in the corner, just as she had in the tapes, her back to the camera. Slowly, she turned, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. She stared into the lens for what felt like an eternity, her lips moving silently. And then, she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was something else entirely, something cruel. She stepped closer to the camera, her hand reaching out, and the screen went black. I destroyed the tapes and the camera the next day. I told my grandparents what I'd seen, and they decided to sell the farmhouse. I haven't been back since, and I have no intention of ever returning. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about Margaret. In the dream, she's standing in the corner of my room, smiling that same cruel smile. And when I wake up, I swear I can hear her voice whispering, "He won't let me leave." It started with a thrift store find. My mom had always loved hunting for antiques, and one Saturday morning, she brought home a tall, ornate mirror. It was framed in dark wood, carved with swirling patterns that looked like vines and flowers. The mirror itself was slightly tarnished, with faint specks scattered across the surface. "Isn't it gorgeous?" Mom said, leaning it against the wall in the hallway. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was just another one of her treasures, something to fill the empty spaces in our old house. But as the days passed, I started noticing little things that didn't make sense. The first time I felt uneasy around the mirror was when I was walking past it late one night. It was after midnight, and the house was silent except for the creak of the floorboards under my feet. As I walked by, I caught a glimpse of my reflection, or at least, I thought it was my reflection. I stopped and turned to face the mirror, staring into it. Everything looked normal at first. My tired face, the hallway stretching out behind me. But then, I noticed something odd. The hallway in the reflection seemed darker than the real one, as if the light from the overhead fixture didn't reach it. And then there was me, or the version of me in the mirror. My reflection stood still, even though I'd tilted my head slightly. I blinked and shook my head, and the reflection mirrored me again, perfectly. "It's late," I muttered, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. I hurried back to my room and shut the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A week later, I was home alone, sitting in the living room and scrolling through my phone. Mom was out running errands, and the house was eerily quiet. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I looked up, expecting to see Mom, or maybe our cat, but the hallway was empty. Then, I realized the movement had come from the mirror. I got up slowly, my stomach twisting with unease, and walked toward it. The hallway reflected in the mirror seemed even darker than before, almost like it belonged to a different house entirely. As I stared, I saw it again. Movement, faint and fleeting, like a shadow passing by. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I reached out and touched the glass, half expecting it to feel cold or strange, but it was just a mirror. My own face stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale. I backed away and went to my room, shutting the door tightly behind me. Things got worse after that. Every time I passed the mirror, I felt like I was being watched, not by my reflection, but by something else. I started avoiding it, taking a different route through the house whenever I could. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the feeling of unease didn't go away. One night, I decided to set up a camera in the hallway. I needed to know if I was imagining things, or if something was really happening. I placed my phone on a small table facing the mirror, set it to record, and went to bed. The next morning, I hesitated before checking the footage. My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone and hit play. At first, the video seemed normal. The hallway was quiet and still, the mirror reflecting the faint glow of the nightlight plugged into the wall. But around 3 a.m., something changed. The image in the mirror flickered, like static on a TV screen. Then, a shadow appeared. It wasn't the shadow of someone passing by. It came from inside the mirror, moving across the dark hallway in the reflection. The shadow stopped in the center of the mirror, and for a moment, it seemed to take shape. A tall, thin figure with long arms and no discernible face. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilted slightly as if it were listening. And then, slowly, it turned. It looked directly at the camera. The screen went black. I didn't tell Mom about the footage. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. Instead, I tried to act normal, though I avoided the mirror even more. I couldn't bring myself to delete the video, but I couldn't watch it again, either. I kept it on my phone, tucked away in a folder I didn't open. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft tapping, like fingernails against glass. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and listened. The sound came again, faint but deliberate. It was coming from the hallway. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping toward the door. As I stepped into the hallway, the tapping stopped. The mirror stood at the end of the hall, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. I held my breath and stepped closer. The reflection in the mirror wasn't right. The hallway behind me looked darker than it should, and the walls seemed warped, like they were bending inward. And then I saw it, the shadow. It was there again, standing just behind my reflection. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. The next morning, I told Mom we needed to get rid of the mirror. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "It's just a mirror," she said. "What's gotten into you?" I didn't have the courage to explain everything, so I just said it was giving me bad vibes. She laughed it off and told me to relax. But I couldn't. I spent the day researching online, trying to find anything that could explain what was happening. That's when I stumbled upon an article about haunted objects. The descriptions matched everything I was experiencing. The feeling of being watched, the distorted reflections, the shadows. One story even mentioned a mirror that acted as a gateway, a portal to somewhere else. The idea made my skin crawl. That night, I decided to confront whatever was in the mirror. I set up my phone to record again, this time holding it as I stood in front of the glass. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What do you want?" At first, nothing happened. I stared at my reflection, waiting, my pulse thundering in my ears. And then, the image in the mirror flickered. My reflection didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its eyes locked on mine. "Who are you?" I repeated, louder this time. The reflection tilted its head, its mouth twisting into a smile that didn't belong to me. My phone screen went dark, and the hallway plunged into silence. I dropped the phone and stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. When I looked up at the mirror again, it was empty. My reflection was gone. The next morning, I convinced Mom to sell the mirror. I didn't tell her everything. I just said it creeped me out, and she finally agreed to get rid of it. We took it back to the thrift store where she'd found it, and I felt an immense sense of relief as we drove away. But the story didn't end there. A week later, I was scrolling through social media when I saw a post from someone in our town. They just bought an old mirror from a thrift store and were showing it off in their living room. My stomach dropped as I recognized the ornate wooden frame. The caption read, "Got this gorgeous antique mirror for a steal, but does anyone else think it feels off?" I stared at the post, my hands trembling. In the background of the photo, I could see the faint outline of a shadow, standing just behind the person taking the picture. When my family moved into the old house on Pinewood Drive, we knew it was a fixer-upper. The place had been vacant for years, and the price was so low it felt like stealing. My parents were thrilled with the deal, while my little sister, Mia, and I were more focused on the fact that we'd finally have our own rooms. The house had its quirks, a creaky staircase, windows that didn't quite shut properly, and a basement that always smelled faintly of damp earth. But it was ours, and we were determined to make it feel like home. The first few weeks passed without incident. My parents worked on repainting the walls and fixing the leaky roof, while Mia and I explored every nook and cranny of the old place. The only part of the house we avoided was the basement. It wasn't just the smell, it was the heavy, oppressive atmosphere down there. The air felt thicker, and no matter how many lights we turned on, it always seemed too dark. One afternoon, while unpacking boxes in the living room, I heard Mia calling from upstairs. "Liam, come here," she shouted, her voice urgent. I found her in the hallway, staring down at her phone. "What's up?" I asked. "Look at this," she said, showing me the screen. She'd been recording a video of her new room to send to her friends. At first, it seemed normal, just a shaky tour of her bed, desk, and closet. But as she panned the camera toward the doorway, I noticed something strange. There was a shadow in the frame, faint but distinct. It didn't look like Mia's shadow, or mine, or our parents'. It was too tall and thin, its edges sharp and defined. Was someone in the hall? I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. No, Mia said, her voice shaking. I was alone when I filmed this. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or a glitch in the video, but the unease lingered. Around midnight, I decided to do some investigating. I grabbed my phone and quietly made my way to the basement door. I didn't have a real reason for going down there, just a gut feeling that the answers might be there. The basement was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. I turned on the light, but the single bulb barely illuminated the space. Most of it was filled with old furniture and boxes left by the previous owners. I started recording with my phone, slowly panning around the room. At first, everything seemed normal, but as I moved the camera toward the far corner, I noticed something strange on the screen. There was a flicker of movement, too quick to catch with my eyes. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. The only response was a faint, whispering sound, like the rustle of leaves. I moved closer to the corner, my flashlight trembling in my hand. And then I saw it. A figure stood there, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and shrouded in shadows, its features obscured, but its eyes, two pale, glowing orbs, stared directly at me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, as if the very fabric of the room was bending. I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. The next morning, I showed the footage to my parents. They brushed it off as a trick of the light, insisting that I was just imagining things. Mia, however, believed me. "It's like the shadow in my video," she said. "There's something wrong with this house." That day, we decided to set up a camera in the basement. I wanted proof, something I could show my parents to make them take this seriously. We placed the camera on a shelf in the center of the room and left it recording overnight. The following morning, I retrieved the camera and sat down with Mia to review the footage. Most of it was uneventful, just an empty basement with the occasional sound of creaking wood or dripping water. But at 3:17 a.m., the camera picked up something chilling. The screen flickered, and the shadowy figure appeared again. This time, it was moving, its long limbs twisting unnaturally as it glided across the room. It stopped in front of the camera, its glowing eyes staring directly into the lens. And then, it smiled. The smile was wide and crooked, stretching far beyond the limits of a human face. The screen went black for a moment, and when the image returned, the figure was gone. Mia and I sat in stunned silence, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "What do we do?" she whispered. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we can't stay here." We showed the footage to our parents that evening. They didn't have any explanations this time. My dad suggested calling a priest, while my mom wanted to contact the previous owners to ask if they'd experienced anything similar. That night, none of us slept well. I kept hearing faint whispers, like voices carried on the wind, and once, I could have sworn I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. At 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from the camera in the basement, which I'd forgotten to turn off. The motion detector had been triggered. I hesitated before opening the app, dread pooling in my stomach. The live feed showed the basement, dark and still. But as I watched, the shadowy figure appeared once more. It stood in the center of the room, its glowing eyes fixed on the camera. And then it spoke. The voice was deep and distorted, more of a growl than actual words. But I understood it. "Leave," it said. The next morning, my parents finally decided it was time to go. We packed up what we could and left the house, staying with relatives until we could figure out our next move. A few weeks later, we heard that the house had been sold again. I wanted to warn the new owners, but my parents told me to leave it alone. Sometimes, I wonder if they've experienced the same things we did, if they've seen the shadow in the basement or heard the whispers at night. And sometimes, late at night, I hear faint growls and whispers outside my window, as if whatever was in that house followed us. When my family inherited my great-uncle Gerald's house, it felt like stepping back in time. The house was a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, with creaky floors, dusty chandeliers, and walls lined with faded wallpaper. Gerald had been a recluse, living alone for decades, and the house reflected that. "It's going to take some work," Dad said as he walked through the dimly lit halls. "But this place has good bones." Mom seemed excited about the challenge, but I wasn't so sure. There was something about the house that felt wrong, like it was hiding something. The strangeness began on our first night there. While unpacking in my new room, I heard a faint sound, like a child giggling. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound stopped. I told myself it was just the wind and went back to unpacking. The next day, while exploring the house, I stumbled upon a locked door at the end of the second-floor hallway. It was different from the other doors, older, with a tarnished brass handle and no keyhole. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Dad, what's in that room at the end of the hall?" I asked during dinner. He frowned. "I'm not sure. The realtor didn't mention anything about it being locked." Mom chimed in. "Maybe Gerald used it for storage. We'll get it open eventually." But something about that door nagged at me. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong in the house. That night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I crept down the hall to the locked door. The air grew colder as I approached, and a faint, musty smell filled my nose. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. At first, I heard nothing, but then, faintly, there it was, a soft, rhythmic thumping, like someone knocking on the other side. "Hello?" I whispered. The knocking stopped. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and hurried back to my room. The next morning, I told my parents what I'd heard, but they brushed it off. "Old houses make weird noises," Dad said. Mia, my younger sister, wasn't so skeptical. "Do you think it's haunted?" she asked, her eyes wide. "Probably not," I said, though I wasn't so sure. Over the next few days, the noises became more frequent. I heard whispers when I walked past the locked door, and once, I swore I saw the doorknob twitch as if someone was trying to open it from the inside. Things escalated when I decided to set up a camera to record the hallway overnight. I placed my phone on a small table facing the door and let it run while we slept. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. For the first few hours, nothing happened. But around 3 a.m., the camera picked up movement. The door, which had been firmly shut, creaked open just a crack. A shadowy figure emerged, its movements slow and deliberate. It was small, childlike, and its features were obscured in the darkness. The figure moved toward the camera, and as it got closer, I saw its face, or what should have been a face. Instead, it was a blank, smooth surface, like a mannequin's head. The figure stopped inches from the camera, tilting its featureless head as if it were looking straight at me. Then, the screen went black. I showed the footage to Mia, and her reaction was immediate. "We have to tell Mom and Dad. They won't believe us," I said. "They think it's just the house settling." That night, I tried to avoid the hallway, but around midnight, I woke to a strange sound, a low humming, like someone was singing a lullaby. The sound was faint, but it seemed to be coming from the locked room. I couldn't ignore it. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way to the door. The humming grew louder as I approached, and when I reached the door, it stopped. Summoning every ounce of courage, I pressed my hand against the wood. "Who's in there?" I whispered. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, a child's voice, soft and pleading. "Help me." I ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I told Mia everything. "We have to get in that room," she said. "What if someone's trapped in there?" Reluctantly, I agreed. That afternoon, while our parents were out shopping, we searched the house for something to force the door open. Eventually, we found an old crowbar in the basement. With Mia watching nervously, I pried at the door until the wood around the frame splintered. With one final shove, the door swung open, revealing the room inside. It was small and bare, with peeling wallpaper and a single window covered in grime. The only furniture was an old rocking chair in the corner, which creaked softly as if it had just been moving. The air was heavy and cold, and the musty smell was stronger here. But the strangest thing was the wall directly across from the door. It was covered in children's drawings, crude, stick figure sketches in faded crayon. Most of them showed a family, a mother, a father, and 2 children. But as I looked closer, I noticed something odd. In every drawing, there was a fifth figure, a tall, dark shape with no features. "What is this place?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, we heard a sound, a soft giggle, coming from behind us. We spun around, but the room was empty. And then, the door slammed shut. We rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, and the giggling turned into a low, guttural growl. The rocking chair began to move on its own, the creaking growing louder and more frantic. "Let us out," Mia screamed, pounding on the door. The growling intensified, and the dark shape from the drawings began to materialize in the corner. It was tall and featureless, just like in the pictures, its body shifting and writhing like smoke. Desperation took over. I grabbed Mia's hand and pulled her toward the window. Using the crowbar, I shattered the glass, and we climbed out onto the roof. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for breath. When our parents returned, we told them everything. This time, they believed us. We left the house that same night, staying in a motel until Dad could arrange to sell the property. A few weeks later, I did some research and discovered that my great-uncle Gerald had been the sole survivor of a family tragedy. His wife and children had died in that house, their deaths ruled accidental, but rumors persisted that something darker had been at play. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that room, but sometimes I still hear faint giggles at night, as if whatever was in that house hasn't quite let go of me. Growing up, my family had a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't fancy, just a one-story wooden structure with a tin roof nestled deep in the forest. Dad had inherited it from his father, and we used it as a weekend getaway. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just trees and the occasional deer. I didn't mind the cabin when I was younger, but as I got older, I started to notice how isolated it felt. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and at night, the woods around us became a black void filled with strange noises. One summer, we went up to the cabin for a week-long vacation. It was just me, my parents, and my older brother, Jake. Everything started out fine, hiking, fishing, and playing board games when it got dark. But by the second night, I started to feel like something wasn't right. It began with small things. The first was the sound of footsteps outside the cabin late at night. I'd been lying awake, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, when I heard them. Soft, deliberate crunches on the gravel path that circled the cabin. I sat up, listening intently. "Jake?" I whispered, but he was snoring in the bed across the room. The footsteps stopped right outside my window. I held my breath, heart pounding, but I couldn't bring myself to look. After a few moments, the sound moved away, fading into the forest. I convinced myself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe, and eventually fell asleep. The next day, while exploring the woods with Jake, we found something strange. About 100 yards from the cabin, there was a tree with deep claw marks etched into the bark. The marks were too high up to be from a dog or coyote, and they were spaced far apart, like whatever had made them had enormous paws. "Bear, probably," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. We moved on, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they were louder, circling the cabin slowly. I sat up in bed, clutching my blanket, and listened as they stopped again outside my window. Summoning all my courage, I peeked through the curtains. In the dim moonlight, I saw a figure standing on the path. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its head tilted at an odd angle, as if it were trying to look directly at me. I gasped and stumbled back, letting the curtain fall shut. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. The next morning, I told my parents what I'd seen. They brushed it off as a bad dream, but Jake took me seriously. "We should set up the trail camera," he said. Dad had brought the camera to capture wildlife around the cabin. It had night vision and motion detection, so if anything came near, we'd have proof. We set it up facing the path where I'd seen the figure and left it running overnight. The following morning, we reviewed the footage. At first, there was nothing, just the occasional squirrel or raccoon. But around 2:30 a.m., the camera picked up movement. The figure appeared at the edge of the frame, stepping into view slowly. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. It paused directly in front of the camera, tilting its head as if it knew it was being watched. Then, without warning, it lunged forward, and the screen went black. We were all shaken by the footage. Even my parents couldn't deny what we'd seen. "That's just someone messing with us," Dad said, though he didn't sound confident. "Out here," Jake replied. "There's no one around for miles." We decided to stay inside for the rest of the trip, keeping the doors locked and the curtains drawn. But the figure didn't leave us alone. On the fifth night, the noises started inside the cabin. It began with faint scratching on the walls, like claws scraping against wood. Then came the thudding, heavy, deliberate knocks that echoed through the small space. At one point, the lights flickered, and I thought I saw the figure standing in the corner of the room, its pale form barely visible in the dim glow. But when the lights came back on, it was gone. By now, we were all terrified. My parents wanted to leave, but it was the middle of the night, and the idea of driving through the dark woods felt even more dangerous. The next morning, we packed up and left. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Weeks later, when we reviewed the trail camera footage again, we noticed something we hadn't seen before. In the background of one of the earlier clips, before the figure appeared, there was movement. A second figure, identical to the first, stood deeper in the woods, watching us. Even now, years later, I can't bring myself to go back to that cabin. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about the figure. It stands at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting, and I can't shake the feeling that one day, it will come back. When I was in my sophomore year of college, I found myself renting a room in a small, run-down boarding house near campus. It was all I could afford at the time, and while the place wasn't luxurious, it was quiet and close to school. The house was owned by a woman named Mrs. Hargrove, an elderly lady who rarely came out of her own quarters on the first floor. The other tenants were a mix of students and retirees who kept to themselves. My room was on the second floor, at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. There was something strange about the hallway. It always felt colder than the rest of the house, and the light above my door flickered constantly, even after Mrs. Hargrove replaced the bulb. But what unnerved me most was the door at the very end of the hall, the last room on the left. The door was always shut, and as far as I could tell, no one lived there. Mrs. Hargrove never mentioned it, and none of the other tenants seemed to know much about it. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear noises coming from that room. Faint shuffling, soft thuds, and once, what sounded like whispering. One evening, after a long day of classes, I decided to record some notes for a project on my laptop. As I listened back to the recording, I noticed something odd. In the background of my voice, there was another sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It didn't match anything I remembered hearing while recording. Curious, I started recording again, this time leaving the laptop running on my desk while I sat silently on my bed. When I played it back, the tapping was there again, louder this time, but it wasn't coming from my room. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the last room on the left. I decided to ask Mrs. Hargrove about it the next day. "Oh, that room," she said, her expression darkening. "It's been locked for years. My husband used to store old furniture in there before he passed, but I haven't touched it since." Her tone made it clear she didn't want to talk about it, so I didn't push further. But the mystery of the room nagged at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks and groans of the old house. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, the tapping sound again. This time, it was louder and more deliberate, as if something, or someone, was knocking on the inside of the door to the last room on the left. The next morning, I told one of the other tenants, a graduate student named Caleb, about what I'd heard. "You've noticed it too?" he said, his eyes widening. "What do you mean?" "I've heard noises from that room ever since I moved in. I even saw the door move once, like someone was trying to open it. But when I got closer, it stopped." His words sent a chill down my spine. That night, armed with my phone's camera, I decided to investigate. I waited until the house was quiet, then crept down the hallway toward the last room on the left. The air grew colder as I approached, and the tapping sound started again, faint but insistent. I pressed my ear to the door, my heart pounding. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, a low, guttural whisper, spoke from the other side. "Help me." I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. The tapping stopped, and the air grew eerily still. The next day, I convinced Caleb to help me investigate further. We decided to set up his old camcorder in the hallway, pointing it toward the last room on the left. We left it running overnight, and the following morning, we reviewed the footage. At first, there was nothing, just the empty hallway, lit by the flickering light above my door. But around 3:15 a.m., the camera captured something chilling. The door to the last room on the left slowly creaked open, just a crack. A pale, skeletal hand reached out, its fingers impossibly long and thin. It gripped the edge of the doorframe, and then the footage cut out. When the camera resumed recording, the door was shut, as if nothing had happened. We showed the footage to Mrs. Hargrove, hoping she might explain what we'd seen. Instead, her face went pale, and she refused to watch more than a few seconds. "That room is cursed," she said, her voice trembling. I told my husband not to bring those things into the house, but he didn't listen. "What things?" Caleb asked. She hesitated, then whispered, "Objects from a seance." He was obsessed with contacting spirits after our son died. He brought them back from an auction: an old mirror, a set of candles, and a wooden box with strange carvings. After that, strange things started happening. Determined to find out more, Caleb and I decided to open the room. That night, armed with a crowbar and flashlights, we forced the door open. The room was freezing, and the air smelled of mildew and something metallic. Inside, we found the objects Mrs. Hargrove had described: a dusty mirror leaning against the wall, melted candles on the floor, and the carved wooden box sitting on a small table. But what drew our attention most was the figure reflected in the mirror. It wasn't us. The figure was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It stood motionless, staring back at us as if waiting. And then, it moved. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at the wooden box. Caleb grabbed my arm, pulling me out of the room as the door slammed shut behind us. We spent the rest of the night in the living room, too scared to go back upstairs. The next day, Mrs. Hargrove decided to have the room sealed permanently. She hired someone to remove the objects and boarded up the door. Caleb moved out a week later, and I followed shortly after. To this day, I still dream about the figure in the mirror. Sometimes, I wake up feeling like it's standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear faint tapping, as if it's still trying to find a way back. I'd always thought rideshare driving was a pretty easy way to make extra money. I was saving up for a new car, so I signed up to drive on weekends. Most nights were uneventful, just picking up drunk college kids or people headed to late-night shifts. But one night, I picked up a passenger who still haunts me. It was a Friday night, and I just dropped off a group of friends at a bar downtown when I got another ping on the app. The pickup location was in a residential area about 15 minutes away. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where the streetlights are few and far between. I pulled up to the pin on the app, a small, dark house at the end of a cul-de-sac, and waited. The passenger's name was Evelyn. I sent a quick message through the app: "Hi, I'm here." No reply. I waited another minute, checking the rearview mirror and glancing at the house. It didn't look like anyone was home. The porch light was off, and the curtains were drawn. Just as I was about to cancel the ride and leave, the back door of my car opened. The woman who got in was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a long, dark skirt and a blouse with high lace at the neck. Her face was pale, and her hair was pinned up neatly. "Evelyn?" I asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She nodded but didn't say anything. Something about her made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way she avoided eye contact or how quiet she was, but I decided not to push it. "All right," I said, forcing a smile. "Where to?" She handed me a piece of paper with an address written on it. The handwriting was elegant, almost like calligraphy. The address was about 20 minutes away, so I put it into my GPS and started driving. The first 10 minutes of the ride were silent. Evelyn sat perfectly still in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap. I tried making small talk, asking how her night was going, but she didn't respond. Eventually, I gave up and focused on the road. That's when I noticed something strange. In the rearview mirror, Evelyn's reflection wasn't quite right. Her face was there, but her eyes, they looked hollow, almost as if they were sunken into her skull. I blinked and looked again, but this time, her reflection was normal. "You okay back there?" I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't answer. A few minutes later, I passed a gas station, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. As we drove by, I thought I saw Evelyn's face in the glass of the window, staring back at me from outside the car. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding, but when I turned around to check the back seat, she was still sitting there, calm and unmoving. "Did you need something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. By the time we reached the address, I was ready for the ride to be over. The location was even creepier than the pickup spot, a crumbling, abandoned house at the edge of town. "This is it?" I asked, glancing at Evelyn in the mirror. She nodded. I pulled into the driveway and waited for her to get out, but she didn't move. We're here," I said, trying not to sound impatient. She finally looked at me, her dark eyes meeting mine through the mirror. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so faint I could barely hear it. And then, she was gone. I turned around, expecting to see her getting out of the car, but the back seat was empty. My stomach dropped. I got out of the car, my hands trembling, and looked around. The driveway was empty, and the house was dark and boarded up. There was no sign of Evelyn anywhere. I checked the app, but her ride had already been marked as completed. Confused and terrified, I got back in my car and drove home as fast as I could. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to look up the address Evelyn had given me, hoping it might give me some answers. What I found made my blood run cold. The house had been abandoned for decades after a family tragedy. A woman named Evelyn had lived there with her husband in the early 1900s, but she died in a fire that destroyed most of the house. Her body was never found. That night, I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but the events of the ride haunted me. And then, the strange things started happening. It began with noises in my apartment, soft footsteps in the hallway, the faint sound of a woman humming. At first, I thought it was my neighbors, but the sounds were too close, too deliberate. Then, I started seeing her. At first, it was just glimpses, a shadow in the corner of my eye, a pale face reflected in the window. But soon, she began appearing in my dreams. In one dream, I was driving down a dark road, and Evelyn was sitting in the back seat. She leaned forward, her cold breath on my neck, and whispered, "You shouldn't have come for me." I decided to check the footage from the dashcam I kept in my car. I'd forgotten about it during the ride, but now I hoped it might explain what had happened. As I reviewed the footage, everything seemed normal at first. I watched myself drive to the pickup location, stop outside the house, and wait. But when Evelyn got into the car, the camera didn't pick her up. The door opened and closed on its own, and the back seat remained empty for the entire ride. Terrified, I reached out to a friend who was into the paranormal. He suggested that Evelyn might be a restless spirit, bound to the house where she had died. "But why would she get into my car?" I asked. "She might have seen you as a way to escape," he said. "Spirits like that sometimes attach themselves to people." "Great," I muttered. "So now what?" "You need to go back to where it started," he said. "Take her back." The thought of returning to that house made my skin crawl, but I couldn't keep living with Evelyn's presence. A few nights later, I drove back to the abandoned house. The road was eerily quiet, and as I pulled into the driveway, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I stepped out of the car and approached the house, clutching a flashlight. The air was heavy, and the silence was deafening. "Evelyn," I called out, my voice echoing in the darkness. "I'm here. Please, just go back." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, and there she was, standing in the driveway, her hollow eyes fixed on mine. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice filled with sorrow. And then, She faded into the darkness, leaving me alone under the pale light of the moon. Since that night, I haven't seen or heard from Evelyn. But every time I drive past an empty house or a quiet street, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting in the back seat, waiting for one last ride. I've always been the type of person who doesn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural. I'm practical, logical, and I rely on science to explain things. But that all changed the night I rented an old Victorian house for a weekend getaway. It was a small, peaceful town in the mountains, surrounded by dense forests and quiet streets. The house itself was charming, a beautiful two-story structure with dark wood paneling and antique furniture. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. The moment I stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off. I was just being silly. I was there to relax and get away from the constant buzz of my phone and work. I had no intention of spending the entire weekend dwelling on weird feelings or paranoia, but that all changed when I discovered the old mirror in the attic. I didn't even know the attic existed at first. I was unpacking my things when I noticed a small door near the back of the hallway. It was hidden behind a large bookshelf that seemed to be there just to keep it out of sight. Curious, I opened the door and climbed up a set of steep stairs, my flashlight flickering as I went. The attic was dusty, filled with boxes and old furniture covered in sheets. But there, in the far corner, was an antique mirror. It was huge, about 6 feet tall, and its ornate gold frame glimmered in the dim light. The glass was old and slightly cloudy, but there was something about it that drew me in. I ran my hand over the surface, wiping away some of the dust, and I stared at my reflection. There was something unsettling about it, something off. My reflection was just as I expected, but the longer I stared, the more I felt like there was something behind me. I turned around, but the room was empty. Only the boxes and old furniture greeted me. Just my imagination, I muttered to myself, shaking it off. I made a mental note to take a picture of the mirror in the morning and left the attic, locking the door behind me. That night, I sat in the living room, sipping on a glass of wine, watching the fire crackle in the hearth. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. I hadn't heard another soul since I arrived. It was peaceful, but in an eerie way. I tried to dismiss it and went to bed early, hoping to shake off the weird feelings. I woke up around 2:30 in the morning to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, as old houses tend to do. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, like someone was walking down the hallway toward my bedroom. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened carefully. Nothing. I waited for a while, too afraid to go back to sleep. Then I heard it again, this time coming from the attic. I froze. The footsteps were unmistakable. I grabbed my phone and, for some reason, started recording. I couldn't explain why I felt the need to document what was happening, but something told me I should. The footage captured the quiet of the house, the sound of my own breathing as I lay in bed, and, faintly, the sound of footsteps creaking on the wooden floors above me. The next day, I reviewed the footage, trying to make sense of what had happened. I was shocked by what I saw. At 2:30 a.m., the camera recorded a figure standing in the doorway of my bedroom. It was a shadowy shape, tall and thin, almost indistinct, but unmistakably human. It stood there for a few moments, as if waiting for something, and then slowly disappeared. I didn't know what to think. It wasn't my mind playing tricks. The camera had captured it clearly, but I tried to convince myself that it was a figment of the camera's settings, some strange glitch in the recording. Still, a nagging feeling lingered in my gut, and I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing in the doorway. That evening, I decided to go back up to the attic and take a closer look at the mirror. I hadn't given it much thought earlier, but now, something about it felt different. There was an energy in the air, a heaviness that I hadn't noticed before. As I walked into the attic, I felt a cold breeze rush past me, despite the windows being shut. The temperature dropped significantly, and I shivered involuntarily. The mirror stood in the far corner, almost like it was waiting for me to return. I approached it cautiously, my breath visible in the air as I stood in front of it. I looked into the glass, my own reflection staring back at me, but then something caught my eye. Behind me, in the reflection, I could see a shadowy figure, just like the one from the night before. It was standing in the corner of the attic, barely visible but unmistakably there. I spun around, but there was nothing. The room was empty. The mirror was just a reflection of an empty attic. I felt a cold hand on the back of my neck. I left the attic in a rush, not bothering to lock the door behind me. My heart was racing, and I couldn't explain what I had just seen. I had to get out of that house. That night, I packed my things and decided to leave early. I wasn't going to stay another minute in that cursed place. I grabbed my camera to check the photos I had taken earlier, wanting to delete everything and forget about the house. But when I opened the gallery on my phone, I froze. There was a photo I didn't remember taking. It was a picture of the attic mirror, but something was wrong with it. In the reflection, I could see not just my own image, but something else. A tall, dark figure, standing right behind me. It had hollow eyes, and its face was twisted in a grotesque grin. I didn't know how to react. The photo had been taken when I was standing alone in front of the mirror, and yet, the figure in the reflection was unmistakable. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my bags, bolted out of the house, and drove straight to the nearest hotel. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the house. The next day, I called the landlord and told them I was leaving early. I didn't bother explaining why. I couldn't. There was no way I could make them understand what I had experienced. But as I was packing up my belongings at the hotel, I noticed something strange. My phone's camera roll had a new photo. It was a picture of the back of the hotel room, taken from a distance, and in the corner of the frame, there was a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a glitch. The figure was following me. I don't know what happened that night in the Victorian house. I don't know who or what that figure was, but it's been with me ever since. I've tried to forget, tried to move on, but I still see glimpses of it in reflections, mirrors, windows, even my own phone screen. I don't know if I'll ever be free of it, but one thing is certain. There's something out there, something that watches you through mirrors and reflections, and once it sees you, it never lets you go. If you ever stay in an old house, make sure to stay away from the mirrors. It's not just your reflection you should be worried about. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to ghost stories. The way I saw it, most of them were just overactive imaginations or explanations for things people couldn't understand. But that changed the night I rented an old house in the country for a weekend getaway with my friends. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing time away from our busy lives, but what I experienced there turned my entire worldview upside down. The house was exactly what I had hoped for: creaky floors, antique furniture, and a charm that made it feel like a step back in time. It was isolated, surrounded by dense woods with no neighbors for miles. Perfect for a weekend of peace and quiet. The owner had told us it was an old farmhouse that had been in the family for generations. The original owner had passed away years ago, and now it was just a weekend rental. When we first arrived, everything seemed normal. We explored the house, unpacked, and settled into the cozy living room, laughing and catching up like we hadn't seen each other in months. I remember feeling an odd sense of quiet comfort in the place, but there was something else too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. An eerie stillness, like the house had been waiting for us. The night was uneventful. We stayed up late playing games, eating junk food, and chatting, but as the evening wore on, I began to notice something strange. Every now and then, I would hear a soft thump coming from somewhere in the house. At first, I thought it was the house settling, but it happened repeatedly. A loud bang, followed by silence. A few of my friends heard it too, but when we looked around, we couldn't find anything unusual. Old houses are just like that, one of my friends said, trying to reassure me. It's just the wood creaking. I tried to ignore it, but as the night wore on, I found myself unable to shake the feeling that something was off. I was about to head to bed when I heard a soft knock on the basement door. Everyone else was upstairs, so I assumed it was one of them coming down for something. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it or misheard the sound. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, trying to ignore the strange noises that kept drifting through the house. Thumps, scratches, and the occasional whisper that seemed to come from somewhere far away. The next morning, I mentioned it to the others, but they all laughed it off. "It's an old house," they said again. "It's probably just the wind or something." But when we gathered in the living room later that afternoon, one of my friends, Kate, said something that made my blood run cold. "I was in the kitchen earlier," she said, looking uneasy. "I thought I saw someone standing in the hallway, but when I looked, there was no one there." I froze. "When did that happen?" "A couple of hours ago," she replied. "I thought it was one of you, but when I turned the corner, the hallway was empty." We all exchanged uneasy glances. None of us had seen anything, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. We decided to investigate the basement later that day. None of us had been down there yet, and we all agreed that it would be a good idea to check it out. The basement door was old and heavy, creaking loudly as I opened it. As soon as I stepped inside, a chill swept over me. The air was damp and cold, and the room smelled musty. I shone my flashlight around the room, and that's when I saw it. A tall, old wooden chest in the far corner. The chest looked like it had been there for decades, covered in dust and cobwebs. "Anyone want to open it?" I joked, though my voice was shaky. "No way," Kate replied, backing away. "Who knows what's in there?" We laughed nervously and left the basement, but the eerie feeling stayed with me. There was something about that chest that I couldn't shake. It was like it was calling me. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I kept hearing faint whispers in the hallway, but when I looked, no one was there. My phone had no signal, and the house was so far from the nearest town that there was no chance of any late-night visitors. But the whispers persisted, growing louder and more insistent. I grabbed my phone to try and record the sounds, hoping it would provide some proof of what was happening. As I began recording, the whispers stopped. Everything was quiet for a few minutes, and I felt foolish for letting my imagination run wild. But then I saw something on the screen of my phone. The image was grainy, but it was unmistakable. A figure, standing just outside the frame. The figure was tall, thin, and hunched over, almost like an old man. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide open, staring into the camera. I blinked, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. I could feel my heart racing as I stared at the footage. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I quickly replayed the video, but there was no figure this time. Just the empty hallway, as if nothing had happened. I checked the timestamp. It was the exact moment I had seen the figure. I was too scared to go back to sleep. I stayed up the rest of the night, my eyes glued to the phone screen, hoping to find some explanation for what I had seen. The next morning, I showed the video to my friends, but none of them believed me. They said it was just a glitch in the camera, or maybe I had imagined it. But I knew what I saw, and I knew that something was in that house with us. Later that day, we all decided to explore the basement once more. Something told me that I needed to go down there and check out that chest. The rest of the group was hesitant, but they agreed to come along. We descended into the basement, and I made my way toward the chest. The closer I got, the more I could feel an oppressive energy in the air, like something was watching me. I opened the chest with trembling hands. Inside, there was nothing but an old, tattered blanket. But beneath the blanket, something caught my eye, a small, dusty journal. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. It was filled with strange, cryptic writing. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. "The old man watches, waiting for the right moment. He will never leave, for he is bound to the house. The chest holds his soul." I shuddered, feeling the temperature drop around me. I didn't know what to make of it, but I felt like I had uncovered something I shouldn't have. The journal was clearly old, and it seemed to have been written by someone who had known the house intimately. That night, things took a turn for the worse. We were all gathered in the living room when the temperature suddenly plummeted. The fire in the hearth went out, and the lights flickered. A strange, low humming filled the air, as if the house itself were alive. I pulled out my phone to record, hoping to catch whatever was happening. As I did, I saw something move in the corner of the screen. I turned the camera, and there, standing in the doorway, was the same figure I had seen before. The old man. His eyes were wide open, locked on me, and his face twisted into an expression of pure malice. I screamed, dropping my phone, but when I turned back, the figure was gone. The house was silent once more, but the feeling of dread lingered. We left the house that night, not wanting to risk staying another minute. I didn't look back as we drove away, but I knew that the old man wasn't finished with me. I still don't know what happened that weekend. All I know is that something in that house was waiting for us. Something old, something that had been trapped for far too long. And the worst part? I think it followed me. Every time I walk past a dark window or hear an unfamiliar sound, I wonder if the old man is still watching, waiting for the right moment to make his presence known again. And no matter how many times I check the footage, I can't shake the feeling that he's still there, just outside the frame, waiting for the perfect time to return. I didn't believe in ghosts. I was the type of person who thought ghost stories were just tales made up to scare children or entertain people at sleepovers. But that changed the night I stayed in the old house on Blackwood Lane. What happened there, and the footage I later found on my camera, is something I can't explain. To this day, I can't look at a dark room without feeling like something's watching me. It started out like any other weekend getaway. My friends and I had rented an old house for a few days, thinking it would be fun to get out of the city and have some time to ourselves. The house was huge, with dark stone walls and large windows that looked out over a dense forest. It had an eerie charm to it, something that should have been a red flag, but none of us thought twice about it. The place had character, they said. I had always been drawn to old, historic houses, so when I found it online, I was sold. We arrived late in the afternoon, and the house already had an air of mystery to it. The owner had left a note saying the place was a little eccentric, but everything seemed perfectly normal on the surface. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That night, after unpacking, we decided to explore. The house was divided into several rooms, but the most interesting feature was the basement. It was tucked away in the back corner of the house, and the door was old and heavy, a large brass handle creaking when I tried to open it. "Let's not go down there just yet," one of my friends, Ethan, suggested, but the rest of us were already intrigued. It felt like we had to go. Something was pulling us toward it. We grabbed a flashlight and ventured down. The basement was cold and smelled musty, like it hadn't been touched in years. As we explored, we found old furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked in the corners, and strange items we couldn't identify. But there was one room in particular that caught my attention. At the far end of the basement, behind a dusty old curtain, was a small, locked door. It looked old, with a brass handle, but it was tightly secured with a padlock. There was no key, and no one seemed to know what was behind it. "Let's just leave it," said Clara, one of my friends. "I get the feeling we shouldn't mess with it," but of course, curiosity got the better of us, and we ended up prying the padlock off. Inside, the room was small and narrow, with peeling wallpaper and a faded rug on the floor. The strangest thing, though, was the heavy, wooden chest in the middle of the room. It looked ancient, almost like something you'd see in a museum. It didn't seem to belong in the basement, and none of us could figure out why it was hidden behind a locked door. "Maybe it's something valuable," I joked, but no one laughed. We all just stood there, staring at the chest. It felt wrong, as if we weren't supposed to be in that room. We decided to leave it alone and return to the main floor, but as I turned to walk out, I heard something strange. A soft whisper. It was as if someone was calling my name, but no one else was around. My skin crawled. "What was that?" I whispered, but no one else had heard it. We quickly left the room and locked the door behind us, but the feeling lingered. There was something about the basement, something about that locked room, that made me feel like we had disturbed something we shouldn't have. That night, the strange occurrences began. We were sitting in the living room, laughing and chatting, when suddenly the air grew cold. The temperature dropped so quickly that I could see my breath in the air. Everyone was silent, looking around, wondering if the heating system had malfunctioned. "Maybe it's just the house settling," Ethan suggested, but no one was convinced. Then, a loud bang came from upstairs, like a door slamming shut. We all jumped up and ran to investigate, but when we reached the second floor, there was nothing. No doors had moved, no windows had been opened. The house was completely still again. "Okay, this is getting weird," Clara said, her voice shaky. We all agreed to stay together for the rest of the night, but the weird sounds continued. A soft scratching noise came from the walls, followed by low, unintelligible whispers. We couldn't figure out where it was coming from, but it seemed like it was all around us. The tension in the air grew thick, and I could tell we were all starting to feel it. Around midnight, we decided to go to bed. I set my phone down on the nightstand, making sure it was charged in case something happened in the night. I didn't expect anything else to occur. After all, we were just tired from the day. But sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again, the whispering. This time, it was clearer. It sounded like a voice calling my name. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. My phone was still on the nightstand, and I grabbed it, opening the camera app. I didn't know why I did it. I wasn't expecting to catch anything, but I began to record, just in case. The room was pitch black, and the only light came from the faint glow of the phone screen. As I held the phone up, something strange happened. I could see a figure moving in the corner of the room. It was tall and shadowy, but its features were indistinguishable. I froze, staring at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure moved closer, its form becoming clearer, until it was standing right next to my bed. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was as if I was paralyzed. And then, it whispered again, louder this time. It sounded like a scream, a desperate cry, but it was coming from the figure itself. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned on the light, but when I looked around, there was no one there. I immediately checked the footage on my phone, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The shadowy figure was unmistakable, standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with wide, empty eyes. There was no mistaking it. The room was empty when I turned the light on, but the figure had been there, and it had been caught on camera. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed up, replaying the video over and over again. When the others woke up, I showed them the footage, but they didn't believe me. They said it was just a trick of the light, or that I was seeing things. But I knew what I saw. The next day, we decided to leave the house. We packed up our things and left without saying goodbye to the owner. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. Something dark. Something that had been waiting in that house for a long time. That was weeks ago, but the strange occurrences haven't stopped. I still see the figure in the shadows sometimes, in mirrors, in the corner of rooms, and every time I pull out my phone, I find new footage, more of the shadowy figure, always lurking just outside the frame. I don't know what it wants or why it's following me, but I know one thing for sure. I will never set foot in that house again. And if you ever come across a house with a locked room, don't open it, because you never know what might be waiting inside. Growing up, I never believed in ghosts or paranormal activity. I was always the one debunking strange stories and laughing off creepy videos as hoaxes. That all changed last summer when my friends and I stayed at an old inn during a road trip. What happened there still haunts me, and the footage I captured that night is something I can't bring myself to watch again. It started innocently enough. We had been on the road all day, exploring small towns and taking in the countryside. By evening, we were exhausted and looking for a place to crash. We stumbled upon a quaint inn just off the main road, nestled between the trees. It looked like it had been there for over a century, with ivy climbing up the stone walls and wooden shutters that creaked in the wind. The innkeeper was an older man with a friendly smile but tired eyes. He welcomed us warmly and said we were lucky. They had one room left, room 13. I noticed the hesitation in his voice when he mentioned the room number, but I brushed it off. Superstition wasn't something I believed in. Are you sure it's not haunted? I joked, nudging my friend Emily. The innkeeper's smile faltered for a split second. People say the whole inn has its quirks, he replied, his tone light but evasive. But room 13 is perfectly fine. We took the key and headed upstairs. The hallway leading to our room was narrow, with old wallpaper peeling at the edges and dim lighting that flickered slightly. The air felt heavier as we approached the door, but I chalked it up to my imagination. Inside, the room was simple but charming. A large bed, a small dresser, and a tall, ornate mirror mounted on the wall across from the bed. The mirror immediately caught my attention. It was massive, with an intricately carved wooden frame that looked like it belonged in a museum. Its surface was spotless, almost unnaturally so. reflecting the room with perfect clarity. That night, after dinner, we returned to the room and settled in. Emily and I were sharing the bed, while our other friends, Jake and Sophie, spread out sleeping bags on the floor. We spent a couple of hours chatting and laughing, the way you do on trips like this, but as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with small things. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, even though the thermostat was set to a comfortable level. Emily complained that she felt like she was being watched, but we all teased her, saying she was just creeped out by the old mirror. Jake joked about filming the night's events, pulling out his camera and panning it around the room. "That thing definitely has some haunted vibes," he said, pointing the camera at the mirror. "Maybe we'll catch something." We all laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. Something about the mirror did feel off, like it didn't belong in the room, or in this world. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. I was drifting off when I heard it, a soft scratching sound, like fingernails on glass. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up, scanning the room. Everyone else was asleep, but the sound continued, faint but persistent. It was coming from the mirror. I froze, staring at the mirror in the dim light. At first, it reflected the room perfectly, showing Emily and me in bed and Jake and Sophie on the floor. But as I looked closer, I noticed something wasn't right. The reflection didn't match reality. In the mirror, there was a fifth figure. It was standing in the corner of the room, a shadowy shape that was tall and impossibly thin. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking I was imagining it. But when I looked back, it was still there. I reached over and shook Emily awake. "Look," I whispered, pointing at the mirror. She groggily opened her eyes and followed my gaze. The moment she saw it, she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake stirred awake at the sound of our voices. "What's going on?" he mumbled. I pointed at the mirror. There's someone in the reflection." Jake grabbed his camera and turned it on, pointing it at the mirror. The moment he started recording, the figure moved. Slowly, it turned its head, as if it had just noticed us watching. Its face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "What the hell is that?" Sophie whispered, now awake and staring at the mirror. None of us had an answer. Jake continued recording, but his hands were shaking so badly that the footage was jittery. The figure in the mirror began to move closer, its long, spindly limbs stretching unnaturally as it approached the glass. But when I turned to look at the actual corner of the room, there was nothing there. "It's only in the mirror," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Panic set in. Jake dropped the camera and ran to the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The doorknob rattled uselessly in his hands. "It's locked," he shouted. "No, I unlocked it earlier," Sophie said, rushing to help him. But no matter how hard they tried, the door wouldn't open. Meanwhile, the figure in the mirror continued its slow approach. It reached the surface of the glass, its long fingers pressing against it as if testing the barrier. Then, it began to push. The glass rippled, like water disturbed by a pebble. The figure's hand started to emerge, its fingers curling around the edge of the mirror. Emily screamed, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the bed. "What do we do?" Sophie cried, her voice filled with terror. Jake grabbed his camera again, holding it up as if it would somehow protect us. The figure's arm was halfway out of the mirror now, its claw-like fingers gripping the frame. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold dread settle over me, like I was being pulled into the glass. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book from the dresser, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, shards flying in every direction. The figure let out an ear-piercing screech, a sound that was neither human nor animal, before disappearing into the shards of glass. The room fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. The door unlocked on its own, creaking open slightly. We didn't wait around to ask questions. Grabbing our things, we bolted from the room and ran downstairs. The innkeeper was standing in the lobby, his face pale. "Room 13?" he asked, his voice heavy with resignation. We nodded. too shaken to speak. He sighed deeply. I told my wife we should have closed that room off for good. It's the mirror. It belonged to the original owner of the house. He died in that room over a century ago. People say his spirit is trapped in the glass. We didn't ask any more questions. We left the inn that night and drove until we found a motel. None of us slept, and none of us spoke much about what had happened. But the strangest part came later, when Jake reviewed the footage on his camera. The video showed everything. The figure in the mirror, its hand emerging, the moment I smashed the glass. But as the shards fell to the ground, the figure didn't disappear. Instead, it turned its head to the camera, its hollow eyes filling the screen. And then it smiled. Jake deleted the footage immediately, but the damage was already done. To this day, I can't look at a mirror without feeling like something is watching me from the other side. And sometimes, when I catch my reflection out of the corner of my eye, I swear I see it smiling back. It all started when I moved into the house on Harper Street. I was fresh out of college, eager for a fresh start, and the rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so. It was an old house, 2 stories tall, with creaky wooden floors and a faint smell of dust and mildew that no amount of air freshener could eliminate. But it had charm, or so I told myself. The landlord had only one rule: don't go into the attic. He claimed it was unsafe, with weak floorboards and exposed nails. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, who needs an attic? I had enough space in the rest of the house for my belongings. The first few weeks were uneventful. I settled in, unpacked my things, and began to feel at home. But then the noises started. At first, it was subtle, faint creaks and thuds that I dismissed as the house settling. Old houses make noises, right? But then the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. It was always at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. A shuffle here, a knock there, and what sounded like faint footsteps coming from above me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a raccoon or some other animal that had found its way into the attic. But deep down, I knew something was off. One night, the noises were so loud that they woke me up. I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding, listening to the distinct sound of something moving above me. It wasn't random anymore. It was rhythmic, almost like someone pacing back and forth. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. With a deep breath, I climbed out of bed and made my way to the attic door. It was locked, as always, but the faint noises continued, almost taunting me. I placed my ear against the wood, and for the first time, I heard it, a voice. It was muffled, barely audible, but it was definitely a voice. It sounded like a woman, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. My blood ran cold. The next morning, I called the landlord. He seemed annoyed when I brought up the noises. "It's just the house," he said dismissively. "It's old. They creak and groan all the time. Don't worry about it." But I heard someone. I insisted. "There's something, or someone." In the attic, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I told you not to go into the attic," he said, his tone firm. "Just stay out of there." Frustrated, I hung up. Clearly, he wasn't going to help me. That evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I set up my old video camera on a tripod in my bedroom, pointed at the attic door. If there really was something up there, I was going to catch it on tape. That night was the worst yet. The noises started around midnight. Soft whispers and faint shuffling sounds that seemed to grow louder as the hours passed. I tried to ignore them, but then came the knock. 3 distinct knocks on the attic door. I sat up in bed, my body frozen with fear. The knocks came again, louder this time. I wanted to scream, to run out of the house, but I couldn't move. It was like something was holding me in place. Finally, I worked up the courage to grab my phone and turn on the flashlight. I tiptoed over to the attic door, my hands trembling. The knocks had stopped, but the silence was somehow worse. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath, and then, bang! Something slammed against the other side of the door, so hard that it rattled in its frame. I stumbled backward, dropping my phone, and bolted back to my bed. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I reviewed the footage from the camera. At first, everything looked normal. Just me sleeping in bed, the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. But then I saw it. At around 2 a.m., the attic door slowly creaked open, just a crack. My heart sank as I watched a shadowy figure emerge from the darkness. It was tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. The figure stood in the doorway for a moment, as if watching me, before retreating back into the attic and closing the door behind it. I felt sick. I rewound the footage and watched it again, hoping I had imagined it. But no, it was there, clear as day. Someone, or something, had come out of the attic while I slept. I called the landlord again, demanding answers. "Look," he said, his voice tense. "There's a reason I told you to stay out of the attic. The last tenant, let's just say she had some problems. She was unstable. She spent most of her time up there, convinced she was talking to someone, or something. She left in a hurry, and I haven't been able to clean it out since. Are you saying someone's living up there?" I asked, my voice shaking. "No," he said quickly. "No one's living up there. Just don't open that door. Trust me." I hung up, more terrified than ever. If no one was living up there, then what had I seen on the footage? That night, I set up the camera again, this time with the light on. I also kept my phone in my hand, ready to call the police if anything happened. The house was eerily quiet, but I could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. Around 3 a.m., the noises started again. A soft shuffling, followed by the faint creak of the attic door opening. I stared at the camera screen, my heart racing as the figure appeared once more. This time, it didn't stay in the doorway. It stepped out into the room. The figure moved slowly, its head tilting at odd angles as if trying to get a better look at me. It was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were sunken and hollow. It stopped at the foot of my bed, staring down at me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I just lay there, paralyzed with fear as the figure reached out a long, bony hand toward me. I felt a cold breeze brush against my face, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. When I checked the footage the next morning, my worst fears were confirmed. The camera had caught everything: the attic door opening, the figure stepping into the room, and its slow approach to my bed. But the strangest part was the final frame. As the figure disappeared, it turned toward the camera and smiled. I packed my things and left the house that same day. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing my security deposit. Whatever was in that attic, it wasn't human, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it wanted. I haven't gone back to the house since, but I've heard stories from other people who lived on Harper Street. They say the house has been vacant for years, that no one stays there for long. Some say the figure in the attic is the spirit of the woman who lived there before me, still searching for whatever haunted her in life. Others believe it's something far older, something that's been trapped in the house for decades. Whatever it is, I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that smile. It wasn't a smile of kindness or joy. It was a warning, and I'll never forget it. Growing up, I never liked dolls. Something about their glassy eyes and frozen smiles always unnerved me. My mom, on the other hand, loved them and filled our house with a collection of antique dolls she had been curating for years. I never paid much attention to them, as long as they stayed on their shelves and out of my room. But one doll in particular changed everything. It was late autumn when my mom found the doll at a local estate sale. It stood out even among her other collectibles. The doll was about 2 feet tall, with porcelain skin, golden ringlets of hair, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. She dressed in a frilly Victorian-style gown, complete with a lace bonnet. Mom named her Lily and displayed her prominently on a shelf in the living room. The moment Lily entered our home, things started to feel off. The first incident happened just a few days after my mom brought Lily home. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it, a soft, faint whisper. It was so quiet I wasn't even sure I had heard it at first. I paused, holding my breath, and listened. "Come closer." The words were barely audible, but they sent a chill down my spine. I looked around the empty room, my eyes landing on Lily. Her lifeless eyes stared back at me, and for a split second, I thought I saw her lips move. "Mom!" I yelled, bolting to the kitchen. "This doll is creepy. Can we get rid of it?" Mom just laughed. "Oh, Don't be ridiculous. Lily's beautiful. You're just letting your imagination run wild. I wanted to argue, but I knew it was pointless. Mom was stubborn about her dolls. But from that day on, I avoided the living room whenever I could. Over the next week, the whispers became more frequent. They always came at night, when the house was quiet, and they always seemed to be coming from the living room. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or the creaks of an old house. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. One night, I decided to record the sounds. I set up my phone in the living room, propping it up on the coffee table and pointing it directly at Lily. Then I went to bed, trying to push the unease out of my mind. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. For the first hour, there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the house. But then, around 2:30 a.m., the whispers started. They were faint at first, barely more than a hiss, but as the minutes passed, they grew louder. Closer, closer. I see you. My heart pounded as I watched the screen. The whispers were unmistakably coming from Lily. And then, as if sensing the camera, her head moved. It wasn't a subtle shift or a trick of the light. Her head turned, her blue eyes locking directly onto the camera lens. I slammed my laptop shut, my hands trembling. There was no way I could explain what I had just seen. That evening, I showed the footage to my mom. She watched it in silence, her face pale. For the first time, she didn't brush off my concerns. "I don't understand," she whispered. "It's just a doll." "Mom, we have to get rid of it," I insisted. "Burn it, throw it away. I don't care. It's not normal." She hesitated, her love for her collection warring with her growing fear. "All right," she finally said. "I'll take it back to the estate sale and see if they'll take it off my hands." But the next morning, Lily was gone. We searched the entire house, but the doll had simply vanished. Mom was upset, blaming herself for misplacing it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. That night, I barricaded myself in my room, locking the door and shoving a chair under the handle for good measure. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and growing closer. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. And then came the whisper, "Let me in." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was high-pitched and childlike, but there was something deeply unnatural about it. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, hoping that whatever was out there would go away. But then the doorknob started to turn. I bolted out of bed and pressed my weight against the door, my hands shaking. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Let me in. I want to play." I didn't sleep that night. When the sun finally rose, I mustered the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty, but at the end of it, sitting on the floor, was Lily. Her blue eyes stared up at me, and her painted lips were curled into a faint smile. I grabbed the doll and stuffed her into a garbage bag, tying it tightly. Then I drove to the nearest dumpster and threw her in, making sure the lid was securely closed. For the first time in days, I felt a small sense of relief. But that relief didn't last long. When I returned home, Lily was sitting on the living room shelf, exactly where she had been before. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. There was no way she could have gotten back here. No way. "Mom!" I screamed. "Did you bring the doll back?" Mom came rushing in, confusion etched across her face. "What are you talking about? I thought you got rid of it." I pointed at Lily, my hands trembling. "She's back." My mom's face turned white. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "This isn't." Before she could finish, the lights flickered, and the room grew cold. The whispering started again, louder than ever. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Play with me. Stay with me. Forever." The sound of glass shattering made us both jump. The mirror above the fireplace had cracked, the web-like fractures spreading out from the center. And in the reflection, I saw her. Lily wasn't on the shelf anymore. She was standing behind me. I turned around, but she was gone. My mom grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. "We're leaving," she said, her voice shaking. "We're leaving right now." We fled the house, leaving everything behind. That night, we stayed at a motel, too terrified to return. Mom contacted a priest the next day, begging him to bless the house. When we finally went back, the priest performed a blessing, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. He seemed skeptical at first, but as he walked through the house, his demeanor changed. He grew tense, his eyes darting toward the living room. "This house has a presence," he said gravely. "Something dark." He insisted on taking Lily with him, promising to dispose of her properly. We didn't ask questions. We were just glad to see her go. It's been months since that day, and the house has been quiet ever since. Mom got rid of her entire doll collection, unable to look at them without being reminded of Lily. I've tried to move on, but the memory of those whispers still haunts me. Every now and then, I'll have a dream about her. Those blue eyes, that porcelain face, and that voice. "Let me in," she whispers over and over again. And sometimes, when I wake up, I swear I can still hear her, faint and distant, like an echo from another world. When my brother and I inherited our grandparents' house, we were both conflicted. The house held years of memories, holidays, family dinners, and lazy summer days spent in the backyard. But it also felt heavy, like it was keeping secrets we didn't fully understand. The house was old, built in the late 1800s, and had a charm that only age could bring. But there was one thing about it that always felt out of place. A small, locked door in the basement. It wasn't like a regular door. It was shorter, almost like it was meant for a child. Grandpa had always called it the forgotten room and brushed off our questions with a gruff, "It's just storage. Don't worry about it." After Grandpa passed away, my brother Ethan and I decided to spend a few weeks cleaning out the house. We planned to sell it, but the process turned out to be more emotional than we'd expected. Each room held pieces of our childhood, and it was hard to let go. We saved the basement for last. It was dark and musty, filled with cobwebs and the smell of damp earth. As we sorted through old boxes, we found strange things: faded photographs of people we didn't recognize, a collection of old keys with no locks, and a handwritten journal with pages torn out. But the most unsettling thing was the forgotten room. The door was still locked, just as it had been all those years. The paint was chipped, and the wood looked warped from years of neglect. But there was something about it that drew us in. Ethan found a crowbar, and despite my protests, he pried the door open. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and started down the steps. I hesitated, my stomach twisting with unease. "Maybe we should leave it," I said. "It's probably nothing. Come on," he called over his shoulder. "A little adventure won't kill us." I followed reluctantly, the air growing colder with each step. The flashlight beam illuminated a small, dirt-floored room with stone walls. It looked like a root cellar, but something about it felt wrong. The room was empty, except for an old wooden chest in the corner. Ethan knelt in front of the chest, brushing away the thick layer of dust. "Help me open it," he said. "I don't think this is a good idea," I replied, my voice shaky. But Ethan ignored me. He opened the chest with a creak, revealing a collection of odd objects: a broken pocket watch, a child's shoe, a rusted pair of scissors, and a doll with one eye missing. At the very bottom was a stack of faded Polaroid photos. Ethan held one up to the light, and we both froze. The photo showed a group of children standing in the very room we were in. Their faces were pale, their expressions blank, but the most chilling detail was the shadowy figure standing behind them, barely visible in the background. We spent the rest of the day trying to make sense of what we'd found. Who were the children? And who, or what, was the figure in the photo? Ethan suggested we stay the night in the house to dig deeper. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we needed answers. That night, we set up a camera in the basement, pointed directly at the door to the forgotten room. If anything happened, we wanted proof. We locked the basement door and went to bed, though neither of us slept much. At around 3 a.m., we heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from downstairs. It was slow and deliberate, like someone knocking on wood. Ethan grabbed a flashlight, and we crept down the stairs together. The basement was freezing, and the air felt heavy. The tapping had stopped, but when we checked the camera, the battery was dead. Ethan cursed under his breath. "I just charged this thing," he said. We turned toward the forgotten room, and that's when we saw it. The door was wide open, even though we'd locked it before going to bed. Ethan insisted on going down to check it out, but I stayed behind, my heart pounding in my chest. I watched from the top of the stairs as he disappeared into the darkness. "Ethan?" I called after a few minutes. "What's going on?" No response. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. Grabbing my phone for light, I descended the stairs, calling his name. When I reached the bottom, the room was empty. Ethan was gone. Panic set in as I searched the basement, but there was no sign of him. The forgotten room looked untouched, the chest still sitting in the corner. I dialed Ethan's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. That's when I noticed something on the floor, another Polaroid. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It was a photo of Ethan, standing in the forgotten room. But he wasn't alone. The shadowy figure was there again, standing directly behind him. I ran out of the house and called the police. They searched the property from top to bottom, but found no trace of Ethan. They chalked it up to a disappearance and suggested he might have left voluntarily, but I knew better. Something had taken him. I couldn't leave the house, not without answers. Over the next few days, I pored over the journal we'd found in the basement. Most of the pages were missing, but the ones that remained hinted at something dark. The entries spoke of strange occurrences, whispers in the night, and a room that shouldn't exist. One passage stood out. "They come for the curious. The forgotten room is their door. Once it opens, it cannot be closed." I set up cameras all over the house, determined to capture whatever was happening. Each night, I reviewed the footage, and each night, I found nothing. But on the fifth night, everything changed. Around 2:45 a.m., the camera in the basement picked up movement. The forgotten room's door creaked open on its own, and the shadowy figure emerged. It moved unnaturally, its limbs jerking as it climbed the stairs. When it reached the camera, it tilted its head, as if looking directly at me through the lens. Then it whispered, "He's with us now." I left the house that night and never went back. I couldn't live there, not knowing what had happened to Ethan. The house was eventually sold to a developer who planned to demolish it and build something new. I hoped that tearing it down would put an end to whatever haunted that place. But a week before the demolition, I received a package in the mail. It was unmarked, with no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed the forgotten room, empty except for the chest, and in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, was Ethan. His face was pale, his expression blank, and standing behind him was the figure, its hand resting on his shoulder. I don't know how the photo found its way to me, but I've kept it hidden ever since. I don't know if Ethan is alive, or if he's trapped in some other existence. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear tapping at my window. I never look. I've been a freelance filmmaker for a few years now. It's not the most glamorous job, but it has its perks. The flexibility, the creativity, it's what I love. A couple of months ago, a client approached me to shoot a promotional video for a small, local theater that had been closed for decades. The building had just been purchased, and the new owner wanted to restore it to its former glory. The job seemed straightforward. They needed footage of the theater's interior, its worn stage, and vintage details for a before and after restoration video. I jumped at the chance to work in such a unique location. Little did I know, that old theater was hiding something far darker than peeling wallpaper and creaky floors. The theater, called the Monarch, had a reputation in town. People whispered about its past, about actors who had mysteriously vanished and patrons who'd sworn they'd seen figures in the darkened wings of the stage. I brushed off the rumors. After all, small towns love their ghost stories, right? When I arrived for the shoot, the building stood like a forgotten relic of another era. Its marquee was cracked and faded, the name barely legible beneath years of grime. The front doors groaned as I pushed them open, and the smell of damp wood and mildew hit me immediately. Inside, the place was eerily silent. Dust motes floated in the dim light filtering through the boarded-up windows. The stage loomed at the far end, its red velvet curtain moth-eaten and drooping. I was alone, just me, my camera, and the empty theater. I started with some wide shots of the main auditorium, capturing the decayed grandeur of the place. My footsteps echoed as I moved through the rows of broken seats, and the faint hum of my camera was the only sound besides my breathing. After an hour or so, I made my way backstage. The air was colder here, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. I set up a tripod and began filming the old dressing rooms and prop storage areas. That's when I noticed something strange. Every time I glanced at my monitor, I saw movement. It was subtle, a flicker in the corner of the frame, like someone darting out of view. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or maybe a trick of the poor lighting. But when I replayed the footage, the shadows were there. They moved unnaturally, shifting against the light in ways that didn't make sense. I chalked it up to an equipment glitch and kept filming, though my unease was growing. By the time I got to the stage, the sun was setting, and the theater was growing darker. I positioned my camera in the center aisle, aiming it at the stage. As I adjusted the focus, I thought I saw someone standing in the wings. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing in the empty space. No response. I climbed onto the stage, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The wings were empty, just stacks of dusty props and old set pieces. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the creepiness of the place getting to me. I went back to my camera and started recording a long, wide shot of the stage. That's when it happened. In the middle of the shot, the curtain moved. It wasn't a slight flutter from a draft. It was as if someone had grabbed it and pulled it back. My heart raced as I stared at the monitor, frozen. Is someone there? I called out again, louder this time. Still, no answer. I stopped the recording and played it back. The footage was clear. The curtain had moved, and for a split second, a figure was visible. A dark silhouette standing just behind the fabric. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I'd gotten enough footage for the client, and there was no way I was staying in that theater a second longer. When I got home, I uploaded the footage to my computer to start editing. That's when things got really weird. The shadows I'd noticed earlier were more pronounced on the big screen. They didn't move like normal shadows. They writhed and twisted, almost as if they were alive. In one shot, a shadow stretched across the floor and seemed to reach for me as I walked past. But the most chilling part was the stage footage. The figure behind the curtain wasn't just a silhouette, it had features. Its face was pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at the camera, and as I scrubbed through the footage frame by frame, I saw its head turn ever so slightly, as if it were watching me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those empty eyes boring into me. By morning, I was ready to call the client and back out of the project entirely. But before I could make the call, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Did you see them?" My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Who was this? And how did they know what I'd seen? I didn't reply. Instead, I grabbed my camera and drove back to the theater. I needed answers. The Monarch was just as I'd left it, dark, silent, and foreboding. I made my way backstage, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air felt heavier this time, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones. I reached the wings and found the curtain. It hung there, lifeless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond it. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from somewhere deep in the shadows, I heard it, a low, guttural whisper. "Leave." I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Leave now." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran out of the theater, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got home, I deleted all the footage from my computer. I couldn't bear to look at it anymore. I emailed the client and told them I couldn't complete the project, citing technical difficulties. They weren't happy, but I didn't care. For weeks, I avoided going near the Monarch or even thinking about what I'd experienced. But the shadows didn't forget. It started with the camera. I'd left it on my desk, untouched since that day, but one morning, I found it turned on, recording. The lens was aimed at my bed. Then came the whispers. They started faint, like the sound of wind through a crack, but they grew louder each night. Did you see them? Do you hear us? Leave. I tried everything, burning sage, hanging crosses, even staying at a friend's house. But nothing worked. The shadows followed me wherever I went. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. The shadows are growing bolder, their whispers more insistent. Last night, I woke up to find a dark figure standing at the foot of my bed. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stared at me with those hollow eyes. I'm writing this as a warning. If you ever hear about the Monarch Theater, stay far away. Whatever is in that place doesn't want to be disturbed. And once you see them, they never let you go. I've always been fascinated by urban legends. You know, the kind of stories that get passed around at sleepovers or whispered in the dark corners of a school cafeteria. Most of them are just that, stories. But last year, something happened to me that changed the way I see the world. It wasn't just a legend. It was real. It all started when I moved into a small studio apartment on the edge of town. The building was old, with creaky wooden floors and a musty smell that no amount of air freshener could cover. But the rent was cheap, and as a struggling college student, that was all I cared about. The landlord mentioned something about the last tenant leaving abruptly, but I didn't ask questions. People come and go all the time, right? The first couple of weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time studying, working, and trying to make the place feel like home. But then, little things started happening. It began with noises, soft, almost imperceptible sounds that I could easily blame on the building's settling or my upstairs neighbor moving furniture. But they didn't stop. Late at night, when the world was silent, I'd hear faint whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. But one night, I realized it wasn't my imagination. I had just finished a long shift at work and was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the screen. That's when I heard it, a soft knock at my window. I froze. My apartment was on the third floor, and there was no balcony or fire escape outside the window. Who or what could be knocking? The knock came again, louder this time. My heart pounded as I sat up, clutching my phone like it was a weapon. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. At first, I didn't see anything. The glass reflected the dim light of my phone, obscuring the view outside. But then, something moved. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, passed across the window. I wanted to believe it was a bird or a tree branch swaying in the wind, but deep down, I knew better. Gathering my courage, I climbed out of bed and walked to the window. My fingers trembled as I pulled back the curtain. There was nothing there, just the empty night sky and the faint outline of the street below. I closed the curtain and tried to convince myself it was nothing. But as I climbed back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I decided to set up a camera. It was an old habit of mine, capturing the little moments of life on film. This time, though, it wasn't about art. It was about answers. I positioned the camera on a shelf facing the window and set it to record overnight. If there was something, or someone, outside my window, I was going to catch it. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and waiting for something to happen. The knocking didn't come, but the silence was almost worse. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was watching me. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the dark, still image of my window. But around 3 a.m., something changed. The curtains moved. They didn't billow like they would in a breeze. They shifted, as if being pushed aside by an unseen hand. Then, for a split second, something appeared in the frame. It was a face, pale and expressionless, pressed against the glass. Its eyes were hollow, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart racing. What had I just seen? I called my best friend, Mia, and begged her to come over. When she arrived, I hesitated to show her the footage. What if she thought I was crazy? But when she saw the video, her face went pale. "This isn't normal," she whispered. "You need to get out of here." I wanted to leave, but where would I go? My lease wasn't up for months, and I couldn't afford to break it. Mia offered to stay with me for a few days, and I gratefully accepted. That night, we stayed up late, watching movies and trying to keep the mood light. But as the clock ticked past midnight, the atmosphere in the apartment changed. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and flicker. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost tentative, but it quickly grew louder and more insistent. Mia and I stared at each other, our faces mirroring the same mix of fear and disbelief. I grabbed my phone and started recording as we approached the window. The knocking stopped as we reached the curtain. "Should we look?" Mia whispered. I nodded, my hands shaking as I pulled the curtain aside. There was nothing there. We stood in silence, staring at the empty glass. But as we turned away, something slammed against the window with a deafening thud. Mia screamed, and I dropped my phone. When we looked back, the pale face was there again, its hollow eyes staring at us through the glass. We didn't sleep that night. By morning, Mia convinced me to call a paranormal investigator. I didn't think those people were real outside of TV shows, but at that point, I was desperate. The investigator, a middle-aged man named Richard, arrived later that day with a suitcase full of equipment. He set up cameras, audio recorders, and even some kind of thermal imaging device. "This building has a history," he said as he worked. "There have been reports of strange activity here for years. Most people don't stay long enough to see much." "What kind of activity?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Shadow figures, unexplained noises, that sort of thing," he replied. "But the knocking? That's new." That night, we all stayed in the apartment, waiting for something to happen. The cameras were rolling, and Richard was monitoring the audio feeds. Around 2:30 a.m., the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. Richard grabbed his thermal camera and pointed it at the window. "There's something there," he muttered, his voice tense. We gathered around the screen. A faint shape was visible, colder than the surrounding air. It moved slowly, shifting closer to the glass. Then, the knocking began. Richard told us to stay back as he approached the window. He held some kind of device in his hand, murmuring words I couldn't make out. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, and the shape on the screen twisted and writhed. Suddenly, the window shattered. Glass sprayed across the room as a gust of freezing air rushed in. The pale face was there again, but this time it wasn't outside. It was inside. I don't remember much after that. Richard shouted something, and there was a blinding flash of light. When I came to, the room was silent. The window was intact, and the air was warm again. Richard looked shaken. "It's gone, for now," he said. "But this place isn't safe. You need to leave." I moved out the next day, breaking my lease and draining my savings to find a new place. I never went back to that apartment, and I never heard from Richard again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the knocking. It's faint, distant, but unmistakable, and I know it's still looking for me.